If we begin at the edge of a curtain and step through, what becomes real in virtual reality is not merely what we see on a screen, but what we come to trust as knowledge, what we call self, what we recognize as the space of a mind. The philosophy of virtual reality asks not simply what VR can do, but what it means to know when your senses are invited into a crafted environment that can feel every bit as convincing as the ordinary world, and perhaps even more suggestive of how the ordinary world itself is constituted for us. In this section, we lay the conceptual groundwork, what VR is, how presence operates, what the twin ideas of place illusion and plausibility illusion contribute to the sense of there, and how embodiment reframes perception so that the body becomes not merely a vessel for sensation, but a medium through which meaning itself is brought into being. We will travel through history, through the oldest questions about perception and reality, and into contemporary debates about epistemic legitimacy, belief, and illusion within virtual milieus. We will pause to listen to the voices of Plato, Descartes, Kant, Merleau-Ponty, and the modern advocates of the extended mind like Clarke and Chalmers, and Slater's careful analyses of presence. And we will ask, can VR be a genuine epistemic tool, providing knowledge grounded in perception, or does it pull us toward an ontological curiosity where belief and illusion blur beyond reliable distinction? To begin with, what is virtual reality and what makes it philosophically distinctive? At the most basic level, VR is the technology that creates, in a user's sense, a sixth sense environment. A visually immersive space, perhaps auditory and haptic feedback, possibly gustatory or olfactory cues, that is constructed by computation and delivered through devices such as head-mounted displays, motion trackers, gloves, haptic suits, or projection-based rooms. But the philosophical issue is not merely the technical. It is about the status of perception under controlled simulation. If perception is the route by which we come to know the world, then VR, by enabling perception to be shaped by designed, manipulable, and interactive environments, poses questions about the reliability and function of perceptual knowledge. In the language of the field, there are three linked but distinct notions that we need to keep straight: presence, place illusion, and plausibility illusion. Presence is the felt sense that you are actually located in the virtual space you are perceiving, that you have traversed its boundaries with your body and your attention, that your point of view is contiguous with your own lived experience. Place illusion is the perceptual illusion that the space you inhabit through VR behaves like a real physical place, with real spatial relations, real occlusions, real gravity, and a real object permanence. Plausibility illusion, by contrast, is about the believability of events within that space. It is the sense that what you are perceiving could be true within the story you are immersed in. Even if you know on some level that you are in a simulation, you buy into the causes, purposes, consequences of the events you witness. Slater, a central figure in the phenomenology of presence, is careful to separate what feels like real space from the cognitive appraisal of whether what is happening is physically real. He writes with clear instinct that presence is a perceptual illusion of non-mediated contact, but it is a robust illusion, capable of guiding action and shaping belief. In his terms, presence is not simply feeling that you are there. It is a convergence of sensory coherence, responsiveness, and the brain's readiness to treat the virtual environment as the locus of your current agency. If we step back, we see the deeper philosophical terrain. The ancient questions about reality and perception reappear in a technicized form. Plato, for instance, would have us notice that our ordinary perceptions might be shadows on a wall, an impression of something more fundamental that we do not fully grasp. In the Republic, the prisoner who turns toward the light and, with hard-won effort, comes to understand the forms discovers that the world of appearances is not the end of inquiry. He has crossed a boundary from opinion to knowledge. In our contemporary VR thought experiment, the wall is not merely a cave of stone. It is a computational boundary that can reframe what counts as visible, tangible, and real. When a VR system convincingly renders space, motion, and social presence, we are faced with the age-old epistemic question: does the perception that arises inside VR yield legitimate knowledge, or is it always already a social, technical, and illusory construction? Let us speak in more concrete terms. In VR, there are two layers that anchor our sense of being there. The first layer is multisensory coherence, the alignment of vision, hearing, proprioception, and motor feedback so that the brain receives a consistent stream of information across modalities. If I turn my head to the left and I see a wall that corresponds to that turn in space, if my legs track my movements, and if the virtual body responds to my intentions with natural latency, then the sense of space feels plausible. The second layer is intentional binding, the sense that the body belongs to the environment in which it is acting. When I reach out and my virtual hand appears to touch a virtual object with precise timing, I do not simply observe an interface. I feel as though I am interpenetrating the world as a mental subject centered in a body. This is how presence becomes a practical phenomenon. It guides expectations, motor actions, and judgments about the environment. The viewer experiences what Slater would call being there, a subjective stance characterized by a privacy of perception. Your mental life is oriented toward a place that might be virtual, yet its significance in your behavior is as real as any other influence in your day. In tracing the history, the philosophical questions intersect with technological milestones. In the mid-20th century, Morton Heilig imagined a device called the sensorama, a sensory cinema that sought to immerse a person in a multisensory environment. Heilig's device was built not to replace reality, but to intensify a particular experiential possibility. You could see, hear, feel, and ride through a street scene, all within a cabinet that carried you beyond the ordinary constraints of ordinary perception. Heilig's dream foreshadowed a world where perception is not simply passive reception, but an active construction of an experiential field. The sensorama's anecdotal narratives still haunt VR discussions as a reminder that the aim of VR has long been to reoperationalize perception by deliberate orchestration of sensory cues. Then came VPL research in the 1990s, which gave us the data glove and early head-mounted displays that made VR more than a fantastical promise. The data glove could translate finger movements into digital signals, allowing for a more intuitive interaction with virtual objects. The adoption of head-mounted displays, with their potential to whisk the user's gaze into a synthetic world, created a sense in which the boundary between self and environment could be altered in more direct and meaningful ways. The data glove showed that limbs could be mapped to digital representations with a fidelity of proprioceptive feedback that was not merely symbolic but embodied. People could move their hands in the real world and witness corresponding changes in the virtual world, reinforcing the sense that the mind's intentions were shaping the external world in real time. These early feats absolute reformers of perception, how we interact with space, how we locate ourselves within it, and how we calibrate trust in the senses. Alongside these hardware milestones, another partner in the story was the rise of the CAVE system, an acronym that sounds almost like a lullaby of the mind. CAVE Automatic Virtual Environment. In the 1990s, researchers built rooms in which walls projected immersive images, creating a sense of immersion not via a helmet, but by projecting stereoscopic environments onto the walls and floor. The cave is a historical anecdote about communal immersion, about shared presence, about the social dimension of perception. A user steps into the room, tilts the head, and the environment responds with parallax and depth cues. The sense of being present is augmented by the room itself. You're not looking at a screen, you are inside a constructed world that is big enough to host collective presence and shared action. The cave era reminds us that presence is not only a private phenomenology of a single subject, but a relational experience. The way a group of people cohabits a space that is at once digital and physical, where perceptual trust is negotiated through shared cues, timing, and normative behavior. If we all reach for the same thing, does the thing exist for us all in the same way? This is the social epistemology of presence. In the 2010s, consumer VR revived as a mass medium and economic phenomenon, with devices like the Oculus Rift, HTC Vive, and PlayStation VR. The revival is not only a hardware story, it is a story about how perception, belief, and knowledge are affected by widespread access to immersive systems. The consumer wave changed the scale at which VR can be studied as a technology of knowledge, not merely a curiosity of labs. It also broadened the field of inquiry. The more people use VR, the more we observe the variations across individuals, cultures, and contexts. The way presence is shaped by prior experience, by the willingness to suspend disbelief, by the degree of immersion offered by devices, and by the design choices of software authors. The revival invites new questions about epistemic reliability. To what extent can the knowledge gained in VR be trusted when the hardware is imperfect, when latency causes motion sickness, when field of view and resolution cause sensory artifacts? It invites questions about the ethics of design. When a system can manipulate a user's sense of space and presence, what duties do designers owe to the user's perceptual life and to their sense of trust? To connect these historical threads with the perennial philosophical inquiries, we must turn to the central thinkers who anchor our discourse: Plato, Descartes, Kant, Merleau-Ponty, and the moderns who push the boundaries of the mind's reach. Clarke and Chalmers and Slater. The aim is not to reduce VR to a mere application of their ideas, but to illuminate how their questions ripen in the crucible of immersive media. What is real, what can be known, what counts as evidence, and where the boundary lies between belief and illusion? Plato invites us to consider the cave and the shadows. If VR can simulate a world with such fidelity that it becomes a perceptual possibility, does it not echo the cave prisoner who confuses appearances for reality? The cave allegory in the modern context becomes a vivid metaphor for a VR citizen's epistemic hazard. The possibility that the world you come to inhabit through a headset is not simply a different world. It is a different way of being in the world, a world where the boundary between belief and reality can be negotiated, repositioned, and sometimes compromised. Plato would not simply condemn appearances. He would urge that the ascent to knowledge requires a philosophical apprenticeship, a practice of distinguishing what is merely vivid from what is truly form-bearing. In VR terms, the ascent would mean cultivating a skill in epistemic discernment, learning to test the plausibility of the experiences you have, learning to distinguish the perceptual content of a scene from the normative inferences one might draw from it, and recognizing that even persuasive appearances do not necessarily yield the form of truth. The cave, then, becomes a narrative scaffold for understanding VR's paradox, its canny ability to disclose aspects of the world as well as to simulate worlds that are not the world. Descartes is our companion in the more radical direction that VR compels. He gives us the Cartesian doubt and the famous maxim, "I think, therefore I am." In VR terms, the cogito becomes an anchor point for survivability. Even in a deceptive environment, if you are thinking, you are real. But the question persists: what is real about your perceptual experience when you are immersed in a synthetic world? Descartes' method invites us to escalate the question: can the senses be trusted even when they are controlled by a system? The very possibility that the mind could be deceived by a demon or by an elaborate simulation pushes us to examine the conditions of evidence and justification. If VR is a technologically structured demon, how do we reframe knowledge as justified belief grounded in the content of our perceptual interactions? In the sense of the epistemic, VR invites us to ask about the reliability of the cognitive faculties under conditions of artificial stimulation. What justifications survive when perception is mediated, manipulated, and orchestrated? Kant adds another dimension to our inquiry. He exhorts us to dare to know, an injunction that resonates with the spirit of VR's challenge to accept the world as given by our senses. Kant would caution us that the mind brings to bear a priori forms, space, time, causality, the categories of understanding that shape the content of experience. In VR, these a priori structures do not vanish. They are invoked and tested under novel conditions. Space and time become pliable, causality can be tinkered with by the designer, and the sense of distance between agent and effect can be engineered. This is not a critique of VR's fantasy. It is a reminder that human cognition expects coherence, regularity, and intelligibility. The plausibility illusion depends on those a priori ideals, the rules of physics that we implicitly grant to a world. When VR preserves these rules convincingly, the environment becomes not merely convincing but epistemically credible because the mind's own cognitive architecture accepts the space as navigable and meaningful. Kant's imperative to know invites engineers and philosophers alike to examine whether VR can expand the range of knowable things, while also testing whether the preconditions of experience, space, time, causality, can be reconfigured without dissolving the intelligibility of the world. Merleau-Ponty marks a turn toward embodiment that is crucial for understanding VR's phenomenology. He writes that the body is not a mere object among objects, it is the primary medium through which the world is given to us. The body is our general medium for having a world, he asserts, a line we must treat as a compass for VR research. In VR, embodiment is not a metaphor. It is the mechanism by which perception is calibrating with meaning. When you put on a headset and your movements in space are mapped to a virtual avatar, your brain's primary instrument, the body, remains the anchor of your sense of presence. The two become entangled in a dynamic feedback loop. Action in the virtual space triggers perception in the real body, and perception in the real body shapes subsequent action in the virtual space. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology suggests that the presence we experience in VR is not just a clever trick, it is a redescription of what perception is. Perception is not a disembodied input-output. It is a living relation between the senses, the body, and the environment. When your avatar moves, you begin to inhabit not only a new field of phenomena, but a new sense of self. The ownership of virtual limbs, the sense that your hand is your hand even when it is rendered in a digital space, becomes a testbed for this view. Embodiment is not optional. It constitutes knowledge of space, time, and agency. Clark and Chalmers introduce a provocative extension of the mind beyond the skull. If the mind is not confined to the head but can extend into the environment through reliable tools and processes, then VR devices themselves become part of the cognitive system. Imagine a VR system that reliably stores steps taken, decisions made, and outcomes achieved within the environment, and which can offload cognitive tasks to the external world by design. The question then becomes not merely whether VR provides a convincing illusion, but whether the augmented reach of the mind into the environment constitutes genuine cognitive economy. If the glove remembers where you touch something, if the headset stores your arrival at a decision point, if the environment provides scaffolds that guide reasoning, then the VR system is part of the extended mind. It is no longer simply a stage for perception, it becomes a partner in thinking. The boundary lines between what is internal and what is external color perception, memory, and reasoning. VR thus becomes a concrete case study for the extended mind thesis. The boundary conditions, what counts as a cognitive resource, how is it integrated, what is the reliability and the transparency of its operation, are tested in real time as you interact with a virtual world. Slater's contribution to the discussion of presence is vital because it sharpens the epistemic stakes of VR. He distinguishes between place illusion and plausibility illusion, and then synthesizes both into a broader claim about perception, presence, and action. The place illusion ensures that space feels like space. The plausibility illusion ensures that events feel like possible and meaningful within that space. When both are aligned, a user behaves as if the environment were not merely a simulation, but a place with causal connections to their actions. Consider this: if you reach out to grasp a virtual object and the system faithfully responds with timely haptic feedback, you are persuaded to treat the object as a real entity within the space. You will pick it up, rotate it, use it to build something, or drop it in response to a sudden event. Slater's claim that presence is a perceptual illusion of non-mediated contact does not deny the reality of the experience. Rather, it emphasizes that presence arises from perceptual coherence and reciprocity. The user's actions and the world's responses align in a way that makes the world feel live. The epistemic import is subtle and powerful. You are perceiving a real-world relationship, even if you know on reflection that the world is a constructed one. Perceptual knowledge becomes a matter of reliability. Does the VR system synchronize cues across modalities so that the sense of space and cause-effect relations hold consistently over time? If yes, the experience is epistemically robust within its own terms. If we weave these threads together, we begin to see VR as an epistemic tool rather than simply a novel simulation. Perceptual knowledge is not necessarily limited to the real world in the sense of the ordinary environment. Rather, knowledge can be grounded in perceptual engagement with a structured environment that yields reliable cues and coherent outcomes. The question is not whether VR provides true knowledge in the sense of correspondence with a mind-independent reality. The question is whether VR offers verifiable knowledge about a domain that would be accessible to us in virtue of the design of a plausible world. When VR is designed to preserve physical constraints and causal relationships, and when users interact with it through robust embodied schemas, then VR becomes a legitimate seat of perceptual knowledge within its own space. The question then becomes how to transfer or translate the epistemic goods gained in VR to the non-virtual world. Can what you know in VR inform what you know about the real world? And if so, under what conditions do we count that knowledge as transferable? The answer, to be sure, depends on the scope of the domain in question. For psychomotor skills, for example, VR training can yield knowledge that transfers to real-world performance when the mapping between virtual and real actions is faithful enough to preserve the necessary proprioceptive and sensory motor contingencies. For other domains, ethical judgments, social perception, or the sense of self in a social space, the transfer may be more nuanced, shaped by the epistemic affordances and the limitations of the simulation. Let us provide two vivid examples that illuminate how embodiment and telepresence operate in practice and how they bear upon epistemic questions. Example A: embodiment and ownership in VR. In recent decades, researchers have demonstrated that people can experience a virtual limb or entire body as their own through a phenomenon known as the body ownership illusion. In experiments, participants wear head-mounted displays that show a virtual avatar aligned with their real body. When the visual feedback is synchronized with the person's real movements and tactile sensations are paired with glove or haptic stimuli, participants report a striking sense of ownership over the virtual limb or even the whole body. In some studies, people feel as if their own arm is extending into the virtual space, and when the virtual arm touches objects, their physiological responses, like skin conductance or proprioceptive drift, indicate genuine perception of ownership. The experience can be so convincing that people react to the virtual environment as if the limb is real, picking up virtual objects, resisting intrusive stimuli, and even displaying motoric adaptation, as if the limb belongs to their own body. The moral and epistemic upshot is profound. The body becomes a flexible instrument for knowledge, not a fixed anchor that blinds us to illusion. When you genuinely feel that a virtual limb is yours, your perceptual system reconfigures its constraints, your spatial reasoning updates its metrics, and your action plans incorporate this new body schema. The knowledge you gain about the reach of your influence, about the environment's interactive contingencies, about your own sensory motor capacities, accrues in a way that demonstrably affects how you act. The boundary between self and other, between body and tool, becomes something the subject actively negotiates and sometimes redefines. In philosophical terms, this is not merely a parlor trick. It is a demonstration of the embodied cognition thesis that Merleau-Ponty insisted on. Perception is inseparably linked to the body's capacity to act and to feel. When the arm in VR feels like it belongs to you, that is not simply a curious illusion. It is a reorganizing event in the cognitive architecture that underwrites knowledge of space, object properties, and causal relations. The ownership illusion also intersects with Clark and Chalmers's extended mind thesis. The external device, the glove, the tracker, the haptic suit, transforms the arm into part of the cognitive economy of the user. The boundary between internal neural processes and external apparatus shifts, and the reliability or frailty of that extension becomes a matter of epistemic significance. If the glove fails to register movement, or if latency disrupts the alignment of felt touch and optical feedback, the user's trust in the virtual body's behavior wanes, and the knowledge grounded in embodied action may be destabilized. The lesson is not that VR always provides veridical knowledge about the real world. The lesson is that the epistemic life of perception, how we know when we know, and what counts as justification for our beliefs about space, objects, and action, depends heavily on embodied processes and their integration with what the environment offers through perceptual mediation. Example B, telepresence and the boundaries of self-location. Telepresence refers to the sense that you are located in a remote place or integrated into a remote environment through a VR system. Telepresence experiences can blur what you take to be your own location in space. Consider an instance in which two people, each wearing VR gear, are connected via a shared virtual space. They may find themselves in a virtual room with objects that respond to both of them. They can talk to each other, collaborate on tasks, and even experience the other person's presence as if they were physically present in the same room. Yet the two participants remain in distinct physical locations. What happens to the sense of self-location? The boundary between where I am and where the action happens becomes unsettled. In such a telepresence scenario, the mind's sense of agency can take root in the joint space of the shared virtual environment. You may feel that you are located inside the shared environment and that your action reverberates through a social field that exists beyond the limits of your own body. This can lead to a reframing of the self. The sense of self-location is not a fixed topography, but a navigable borderland that can shift with social affordances, the coherence of the shared space, and the degree to which the environment supports reciprocal perception and action. These examples illuminate the practical and epistemic significance of embodiment and telepresence in VR. They reveal how perception can be restructured in ways that not only provide a convincing experience, but also yield genuine knowledge about one's own motor capabilities, proprioception, and social cognition. The question remains, though, whether such knowledge counts as legitimate knowledge about the world as a whole, or whether it remains strictly a species of perceptual knowledge tied to a particular environment. The analytic answer tends to be pragmatic. If the knowledge gained in VR reliably supports decision-making and skill acquisition in corresponding real-world tasks, and if the design ensures that perceptual cues are coherent and stable, then the knowledge can be justified in its own right and transferred to relevant contexts. We should also think about two salient counterarguments that resist easy assimilation into the standard narrative about VR as a promising epistemic tool. First counterargument. VR may distort trust in perception or foster derealization. The more VR becomes plausible and plausible illusions become persuasive, the greater the possibility that one's sense of the real world deteriorates or becomes unsettled when returning to the ordinary environment. If the line between presence in VR and presence in the waking world falters, there could emerge a sense of derealization, a condition in which the external world itself seems less certain, thinner, or less trustworthy. This is not merely a matter of temporary confusion or the nuisance of cybersickness. It touches core questions about epistemic status. If perceptions can be transparently manipulated through well-designed VR experiences, what stops these experiences from eroding general trust in perceptual evidence? One could imagine a scenario in which highly persuasive VR campaigns or social VR spaces cultivate a sense of reality that diverges from the ordinary world's features. The danger would be a drift toward skepticism about external reality itself, a condition reminiscent of the Cartesian fear but now bred into everyday media. The risk is that the very tools we rely on to gain knowledge could, under certain conditions, undermine the preconditions of rational belief, such as the stability of the spatial frame, the reliability of causal cues, and the continuity of the self over time. If we cannot tell when we are in VR and when we are not, the epistemic boundary dissolves, and with it the possibility of robust justifications, careful inference, and prudent action. Second counterargument. The epistemic reliability of VR depends on hardware limitations and design choices. The faith we place in VR's perceptual knowledge is conditional on the quality and coherence of the technological system. Latency, tracking accuracy, resolution, field of view, calibration of sensors, mismatch between visual and haptic feedback, the possibility of sensory-motor discordance. These factors can break the coherence that underwrites presence and the plausible illusions. If the system is poorly designed, if there is lag between intention and action, if the proprioceptive cues do not align with visual cues, the experience can become jarring, disorienting, and epistemically unreliable. In such cases, users may come away with a sense of skepticism about what they know in VR. The epistemic goods are then not guaranteed by the mere fact of immersion, but by a careful orchestration of perceptual cues that preserve the sense of space, causal coherence, and embodied agency. The hardware realities, processing power, sensor fidelity, display refresh rates, are not mere technical details. They are the condition of possibility for credible VR epistemology. This is not a black and white claim that VR is always unreliable. It is a warning that the reliability of knowledge within VR scales with the sophistication of design and the respect paid to the brain's perceptual commitments. In light of these considerations, what is the broader sense in which VR remains a credible epistemic technology? The short answer is that VR has the potential to extend, revise, and challenge the epistemic life by offering new modes of perception and novel forms of evidence. The long answer is more nuanced. VR can enlarge the scope of perceptual inquiry by enabling controlled manipulations of variables that are difficult or impossible to manipulate in the ordinary world. It allows for the systematic exploration of perception under conditions of altered gravity, altered proprioceptive mappings, or the exposure to altered social cues. It can provide new training regimes that improve motor skill and perceptual discrimination by leveraging embodied feedback. It can also function as a laboratory for thought experiments. One can inhabit the mind of another or live inside a model of a physically inaccessible scenario and see how perception and reasoning unfold under those conditions. The epistemic questions multiply as VR becomes intertwined with AI agents, data-driven simulations, and networked social spaces. The extended mind framework suggests that the cognitive life is not only inside the skull, but distributed across devices, artifacts, and shared environments. VR may then be a particularly potent instrument for exploring the boundaries of cognitive extension, because it is designed to mediate perception, action, and cognition with unprecedented fidelity and control. The debates about VR's epistemology are not only about the limits of perception, but also about the ethical and social implications of immersive technologies. If VR is a tool for knowledge, who is responsible for ensuring that its use is just, inclusive, and mindful of the ways it can alter our beliefs about the world and about other people? If VR can simulate realistic social interactions, it can also manipulate experiences of others' presence, agency, and vulnerability. The sense of presence in a telepresence scene can be used to foster empathy or to manipulate the emotions and attitudes of participants. The ethical dimension thus becomes inseparable from the epistemic dimension. To know how to deploy VR responsibly, we must consider both what we can know through VR and what we must not assume about others' experiences within VR. Let us ground these reflections in two further cross-references that illuminate the broader landscape of VR's theory and history. First cross-reference, Brainy-Navat. The Brainy-Navat thought experiment is a modern avatar of the ancient skepticism about perception. What if our experiences are produced by a hidden cause that misleads us about the nature of reality? VR intensifies this scenario by making the case not just hypothetical but practically tractable. How can we distinguish a truly external reality from a thoroughly reliable simulation that mimics it perfectly? If we accept the possibility that a VR environment could be indistinguishable from the ordinary world at the level of perception, the epistemic project must examine what constitutes knowledge in such conditions. The Brainy-Navat scenario challenges the idea that perceptual experiences automatically provide knowledge of the real world. VR extends that challenge by providing a deliberately crafted context in which perceptual content is controlled, thus forcing us to recalibrate what it means to know something about the world. The philosophical payoff is not mere cynicism. It is a refined theory of justification that recognizes the role of reliability, coherence, and intersubjective verification. If a VR system can be designed to ensure that, even when deceiving the senses, the system's feedback is predictable and consistent in a way that supports correct inference under a given protocol, then the VR experience can serve as a legitimate epistemic environment within its own domain. Second cross-reference, Baudrillard's simulacra and the hyperreal. The phrase, the hyperreal, captures a condition in which the distinction between model and reality dissolves, and what counts as real is embedded in the simulation itself. VR is a laboratory for this collision between the real and the artificial, a technological enactment of Baudrillard's suspicion that simulation can outpace and displace the real. When we inhabit a virtual world with high fidelity, we are immersed in representations that do not simply imitate reality. They generate a new field of experience that can persuade the brain to treat features of the virtual world as if they were features of the real world. The sense of presence is the empirical counterpart to Baudrillard's critique. The more convincingly a simulation reproduces sensory data and causal structure, the more likely it is to be treated as real. The problem is not merely one of deception, it is a question about meaning and significance. If our sense of space, our sense of social reality, and our sense of self are mediated by an architecture of representations, to what extent do we still have access to the real world as it is independently of those representations? Baudrillard's language helps us diagnose the moral and political stakes of VR. If we inhabit hyperreal environments in significant ways, what becomes of our capacity to critique, to understand our own society, and to relate to others in the shared public space? We should also tie the VR discourse to more recent sense of presence literature and to the phenomenology of perception that sprang from Husserl and later thinkers. The sense of presence belongs to a broader tradition that asks how perception is bounded by the body, how attention organizes a field of experience, and how the act of perceiving is not a passive uptake but an active synthesis. The phenomenology of perception emphasizes that we are always already in a field of meaningful interactions. Perception is not a passive receiving of data, but a practical engagement with a world that affords possibilities for action. VR recasts this stance. The world you inhabit, even if generated by software, is a meaningful field of action, the content of which is judged by the same epistemic criteria that govern the ordinary world. The difference is that VR makes explicit the contingencies of the field, which sensory channels are available, how the body is supported or constrained, what the environment makes possible or impossible to do. The phenomenological perspective grants VR a serious analytic space for understanding how presence is produced and how knowledge arises through embodied engagement with a plausible, coherent, and manipulable world. Let us shift to the practical implications of this philosophical framework for the 21st century VR era. VR as an epistemic tool is not simply an argument about mind-body relations or about the status of perception. It is a call to consider how we design, deploy, and govern immersive systems in ways that respect epistemic norms and human flourishing. There are important cross-cutting disciplines here: cognitive science, ethics, education, human-computer interaction, and political philosophy. For example, in education and professional training, VR's capacity to manipulate space, time, and social cues can be harnessed to foster skill acquisition and experiential understanding that would otherwise be difficult to achieve. In the medical field, VR can simulate complex procedures, enable patient-specific planning, and facilitate rehabilitation with graded, adaptive feedback. In mental health, VR exposure therapies leverage controlled environments to ease anxiety disorders or phobias in a safe, progressive manner. In design and architecture, VR offers the capacity to explore spatial arrangements, test ergonomics, and anticipate human interactions in a near-physiological manner before any physical construction takes place. In social and ethical terms, VR demands attention to issues of consent, consent to representation, the ethics of presence, and the governance of digital environments where people's perceptions and emotions can be shaped by others. The sense in which VR intersects with social epistemology is especially intriguing. If VR can host collective experiences with shared sense of presence, the social dimension of knowledge, the ways communities share beliefs, evaluate evidence, and negotiate meaning, becomes an essential aspect of what VR offers. A networked VR space can function as a cognitive commons in which participants contribute to joint knowledge building by sharing perceptual frame, outcomes, and interpretations. This is not merely a parlor trick of social media ethics. It is a serious reconfiguration of how communities come to knowledge about a problem, a scenario, or a field of inquiry. When several scientists operate within a shared VR model of a complex system, say, climate dynamics, molecular interactions, or urban planning, they test hypotheses not only through numbers, but through perceptual experiments that illuminate relationships in ways that are especially accessible to human intuition. Yet the same social dimension can be exploited to distort perception or to manipulate beliefs. If a VR platform for education or public discourse becomes a channel for persuasive illusions or a site of biased narratives that exploit the plausibility illusion, the epistemic damage can be deep. The design of VR platforms must inculcate safeguards that protect autonomy, ensure transparency, and provide robust means of critical evaluation. This is not a call for technocratic control. It is a plea for ethical design that respects the criteria of justification and the integrity of perceptual evidence. To connect the thread to the sense of presence literature in particular, let us attend to the practical implications of presence for knowledge claims. A user who experiences high presence in a VR environment may interpret the environment's responses as causally meaningful. Yet this very fidelity demands a cautious epistemic stance. The more plausible the events and world states, the stronger the temptation to treat them as real, which can be a legitimate sense in VR, but it also requires disciplined reflection to distinguish the VR's domain of knowledge from the non-virtual worlds. Slater's framework helps with this as a phenomenology of presence. It directs attention to how carefully crafted perceptual loops can persuade us to act in a certain way. The test of epistemic legitimacy, then, is not whether the virtual environment is real in the object sense, but whether the perceptual conditions, causal coherence, and intentional alignment across modalities suffice to justify beliefs and actions within the VR domain and to permit responsible transfer of those beliefs outside the VR space. We have now traversed a broad landscape, from the cathedral of classic questions about reality and perception to the laboratory of embodied VR and telepresence, from the sensorama to the data glove to the cave and to the 2010s revival. From the mind as a skull-bound organ to the mind as an open system extending into external artifacts and social environments. From the sense of presence to the ethics of perception and the social epistemologies of immersive technology. The key proposals that emerge in this exploration are multiple and mutually illuminating. VR is not merely a simulation. It is a domain of perceptual experience with its own epistemic norms, where presence, place illusion, and plausibility illusion interplay to shape belief and action. Embodiment profoundly reorganizes perception and knowledge. The body in VR is not just a conduit, it is a cognitive operator that can restructure knowledge of space, time, and agency. The sense of ownership over virtual limbs or bodies demonstrates how perception supports knowledge through embodied schemes that can be flexible and adaptive. The extended mind thesis offers a conceptual frame to understand VR as part of a cognitive economy that includes devices, gloves, trackers, and software. If these external tools are reliable and integrally coupled with internal processes, they can count as proper cognitive scaffolding, extending our minds beyond the skull. Slater's analysis of presence provides a rigorous vocabulary to talk about the phenomenology of VR and to identify the conditions under which VR can be a legitimate epistemic environment. The notions of place illusion and plausibility illusion give us diagnostic tools to study why VR experiences feel compelling, and how to measure the reliability of perceptual knowledge they generate. The critical voices remind us that VR is not neutral. The epistemic gains come with dangers, derealization, distorted trust in perception, and design choices that prioritize engagement over truthfulness. Hardware limitations, latency, and perceptual mismatches matter because they determine whether VR's perceptual experiences can be justified as knowledge rather than mere entertainment or manipulation. VR is both a testbed for ancient philosophical questions and a frontier for contemporary ethics and political philosophy. Braininavat concerns Baudrillard's simulacra and the extended mind theory apply in the VR era with renewed urgency because they force us to articulate what counts as knowledge, what counts as evidence, and what counts as truth in an age of artificial, manipulable perceptual theaters. Before we close, two additional elements deserve emphasis: the sense in which the virtual world is not merely a replica, but a realm that invites its own forms of inquiry, and the ways in which modern interpretations of VR are likely to transform our understanding of reality itself. First, VR invites a kind of epistemic experimentation that is not possible in ordinary contexts. You can alter the basic parameters of space and time. You can alter causal laws to observe how perception adapts. You can stage social interactions under controlled conditions, and you can create perceptual experiments with repeatable constraints. This experimental power is a form of epistemic leverage. You read the world by manipulating the environment in ways that bring to light how perception and cognition are structured. If you do this with humility, you can discover how the mind uses the body, how it calibrates expectations, and how belief is shaped by coherence, anomaly, and contingency. If you fail to maintain epistemic humility, you risk confusing a particularly well-made VR illusion with a claim to knowledge about the world. The historical anecdotes of Heilig, Dataglove, and Cave remind us that the line between a compelling simulation and a robust epistemic instrument is a line we must walk with care, because the stakes are not mere theoretical accidents. They involve how people understand themselves, how they act, and how societies are shaped by media-mediated realities. Second, the modern interpretation of VR is not a single dogma but a spectrum. Some philosophers and technologists emphasize VR as a radical extension of life world, a new sense organ through which perception can be reconfigured. Others emphasize VR as a tool for simulation and testing, a way to isolate variables and to run experiments that would be impractical or dangerous in the physical world. Still others view VR as a new social and ethical stage, a space for anthropological and political inquiry into how communities create shared spaces and shared meanings in digital environments. Across these interpretations, the unity is in the recognition that VR does not simply reflect reality. It participates in the fabric of perception, belief, and knowledge. The potential to shape minds, to teach, to heal, to connect, and to challenge our assumptions about what counts as real is a moral and epistemic invitation to proceed with care. Let me end with a concluding reflection, not as a closure but as an opening. We began with a set of questions about presence, about how perception is framed, and how knowledge arises in the face of design and illusion. We have traced a line from ancient skepticism to modern cognitive science, from the cave to the headset, from the body as a mere instrument to the body as a living medium of knowing. The philosophical story of VR is not simply a story about technology. It is a story about what it means to be a human knower in an age of crafted realities. The mind's hunger for understanding is not sated by the belief that reality can be outsourced to a machine. Rather, it is tested by the ability to recognize and navigate the legitimate boundaries between belief, knowledge, and illusion, within a world where the line between the real and the virtual cannot be assumed as given, but must be continually justified through careful reflection, empirical testing, and ethical discernment. We can then hold two commitments in view. The first is a cautious optimism. VR can extend our perceptual and epistemic capacities in ways that illuminate the structure of perception, reveal how embodied cognition works, and provide powerful tools for education, medicine, design, and social inquiry. The second is a vigilant humility. The more immersive VR becomes, the more careful we must be about the conditions under which its perceptual experiences are treated as knowledge. We must cultivate discernment in the face of presence, keep a critical eye on the coherence of perceptual cues, and ensure that our design choices respect the integrity of perception and the rights of persons. We should remember Plato's cave, Descartes' doubt, Kant's injunction to know, Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on the body, and the modern pragmatisms of Clarke, Chalmers, and Slater. In a world where the boundaries of perception are being negotiated anew, the test of wisdom is not simply what VR can convince us about. It is what VR can help us understand about ourselves, about how we know, and about what it means to live a life grounded in a reliable, ethical, and reflective form of perception. In the end, the ontology, epistemology, and phenomenology of virtual reality are not separate domains but threads of a single inquiry. How can we maintain a robust, just, and meaningful relation to the world as it appears to us through the mediating power of technology? The answer is not a single doctrine, but a disciplined practice of inquiry that integrates history, theory, empirical research, and careful attention to the lived experience of presence. The journey from the Sensorama and the Data Glove to contemporary consumer VR and beyond is a continuous invitation to re-examine what counts as knowledge, what counts as evidence, and what it means to be present in a world that is at once real and manufactured. And the more we listen to the voices of the ancient philosophers alongside the insights of our modern cognitive theorists, the more likely we are to steward a VR future that respects truth, nurtures understanding, and enacts empathy within the shared space of human inquiry. The room is quiet, but the air feels charged with possibility. We're stepping into a conversation that never fully existed before the invention of virtual reality, a conversation about ethics, identity, and agency inside spaces that are not merely places we inhabit, but realities we co-create. In these new environments, the boundaries between self and other, between action and consequence, between virtue and distortion, become permeable. And if philosophy is the art of asking the right questions about how we ought to live, VR gives us a whole laboratory in which to test our questions under conditions of heightened presence, immediate feedback, and radically reconfigurable social norms. To begin, we must acknowledge origins that are old in spirit even as they are new in form. The question of what we owe to others in a moral universe was not born with holograms or head-mounted displays. Aristotle asked what it means to live well, to cultivate virtue through recurring choices, to habituate ourselves into patterns of character that reliably lead to human flourishing. He wrote in effect that excellence is achieved through practice, through repeated acts that become second nature. The famous line, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit, is more than an aphorism. It's a claim about moral cultivation. If virtue is a habit, then the ways we practice moral life matter profoundly, not only for outcomes but for what kind of person we become in the process. Kant brings a contrasting but equally foundational voice. He asks us to consider the maxim by which we choose to act and then to universalize it. The imperative is not to maximize pleasure or minimize pain in the moment, but to treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, always as an end, never merely as a means. That command, in one well-known formulation, is, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In VR, that question presses in a particularly intimate way. If I perform an action inside a virtual world, even one that doesn't affect a real body in the moment, am I performing it only as a simulation, or am I practicing a manner of conduct that I intend to generalize to the broader domains of life? Do the rules I adopt in an avatar's interactions, how I treat a digital other, whether I respect a boundary, whether I follow or break consent, count as moral acts because they shape patterns of character, or do they merely reflect the constraints of a created space? Hume offers a different lens, focusing on our social nature and the role of sympathy in moral life. Reason, he argues, is the slave of the passions. It is our sentiments, our capacity to feel with others, to imagine their pains and joys, that guides moral judgment. In VR, where we often encounter others not as bodies but as avatars, the question of sympathy takes a striking form. When you look at someone's avatar, you don't simply observe an outward appearance. You enter a social negotiation about what it means to be present, to be seen, to be treated with consideration. Hume reminds us that moral life grows out of the shared space of failing. The way we respond to distress, the way we calibrate our actions to avoid adding to another's harm, the capacity to imagine consequences beyond our own immediate experience. Judith Butler adds a crucial, destabilizing dimension, performativity. In the realm of VR, gender and identity can become not fixed essences but enacted, stylized, and negotiated performances. As Butler would have it, there is no fixed gender identity behind the expressions of gender. In a space where embodiment is modular, where you can choose a tall, lithe silhouette one day and a shorter, heavier one the next, where skin tone and body shape can be swapped in an instant, questions of authenticity, representation, and power are thrown into relief. If identity in VR is performative in the sense Butler articulates, then avatar choice becomes itself a political act. It becomes a decision about how we want to be seen, how we want to see others, and what norms we want to enforce or challenge in digital social life. In this sense, VR becomes a stage where debates about the politics of representation are not merely theoretical or cultural. They are practical, daily, sometimes intimate experiments in the ethics of visibility. Sherry Turkle provides a sociological mirror to our technological practices. Technology, she argues, is not neutral. It shapes how we relate, how we listen, how we understand ourselves in relation to others. In her reflections on digital culture, she has reminded us that technology doesn't just change what we do, it changes who we are. In VR, that effect is intensified by the immediacy of presence, by the sense of being across from someone even when you are in a headset, by the felt immediacy of another's gaze or reaction. The ethics of VR, then, does not merely concern what we do inside a headset, but what we become in relation to others as we practice and rehearse social life in a medium that amplifies both empathy and harm. Nick Bostrom helps us frame a more metaphysical, high-stakes concern: simulation, existential risk, and the status of reality itself. If it is possible that advanced civilizations run simulations, and if there are many such simulations, what ethical responsibilities emerge for designers, for participants, for societies that dream of simulated lives? Bostrom's reflections push us to ask whether the moral obligations we have inside a simulated environment reverberate beyond it, whether there's a duty to create worlds of care rather than worlds of cruelty, and whether we owe future inhabitants of simulations something akin to justice. The ethics of VR in this telling are also questions about the kinds of worlds we choose to create, the kinds of beings we permit to flourish within them, and the kind of character we cultivate by inhabiting, altering, and finally relinquishing those worlds. Luciano Floridi anchors the discussion in information ethics, a field that treats information as a basic object of ethical reflection. In a VR ecosystem, data, algorithms, representations, and the architectures of the experience are not neutral scaffolding. They are active forces that shape perception, opportunity, and harm. Floridi invites us to consider how information processes govern power, consent, privacy, and accountability. If data trails and biometric inputs feed into an avatar's behavior or into the scene's response patterns, then who is responsible when a simulated action causes real-world consequences? How do we design consent to cover the layered realities of VR, the avatar, the platform, the service provider, and the varied contexts in which people choose to participate? Floridi's framework urges a move from thinking about rights in a purely human sense to considering informational rights, informational harm, and the duties we owe when information flows are entangled with embodiment, identity, and agency. This mosaic of thinkers helps us map a terrain where moral theory meets digital practice. It's not merely a matter of applying Kant or Aristotle to a VR scenario as if the virtual act were a mere thought experiment. It's a matter of asking, when I embody in a virtual space, what kind of moral agent am I becoming, and what kind of moral world am I assisting in fabricating? The questions are practical as well as normative, because in VR our actions produce traces, behavioral data, relational patterns, the shaping of norms that reverberate outside the headset. Now let's turn to the central topics that VR makes audibly urgent: avatar embodiment, identity, and the politics of representation in virtual spaces. The promise of VR is to offer a more vivid sense of presence, a felt givenness to another's lived experience. But that promise meets tricky thresholds. Embodiment in VR is not just about visual fidelity or motion tracking. It's about the unspoken grammar of interaction, where you place your avatar, how you gesture, how you respond to another's proximity, how you acknowledge or overlook someone else's boundaries. The embodiment of race and gender in VR raises urgent questions about misrepresentation, stereotyping, and harm. If an avatar's appearance reinforces stereotypes, if the user's own body image is dissonant with their identity or current social context, if a platform's defaults privilege certain bodies over others, then the ethical burden shifts toward platform design, governance, and community norms. The Proteus effect, a term borrowed from social psychology research, helps illuminate how avatar appearance can modulate behavior. The basic idea is that the visual traits of an avatar, height, perceived aggressiveness, attractivity, formality, can influence the user's posture, communication style, risk tolerances, and even ethical judgments within the simulated space. When a user inhabits a taller, more imposing avatar, they may adopt more assertive conversational patterns. When they inhabit a more diminutive avatar, they may defer or self-censor more readily. In other words, embodiment doesn't simply reflect our pre-existing tendencies, it can amplify, dampen, or redirect them. This has profound ethical significance because it means that VR technologies aren't just passive windows into another moment. They are active shapers of moral agency, capable of expanding or constraining our capacity for empathy, restraint, or aggression. Consider gender in VR. Performativity narratives remind us that many users deliberately experiment with gender presentations that diverge from their offline selves. Some experiences of VR self-representation reveal liberating possibilities, a space to explore identities that social environments might constrain. Others reveal power dynamics that reinforce harmful norms. A male-presenting avatar that dominates chat, a female-presenting avatar that invites harassment, or a non-binary avatar that becomes a target for misrecognition or disrespect. The ethical questions radiate outward. What responsibilities do platform designers have to protect participants from harassment, and what capacities do users have to resist or transform the norms that shape their experiences? Judith Butler helps us see that these are not mere style decisions. They are political decisions about who gets to define the terms of visibility and access in shared digital spaces. If the social contract of a VR platform promises equal consideration and safe participation, then how do we ensure that that promise translates into concrete protections, policies, and interventions? Race is another axis where VR demands careful attention. Avatars can reproduce racialized features, but in ways that sometimes misrepresent or trivialize the lived experiences of people of color. The risk is not only cosmetic, it is epistemic and ethical. If a platform's visual language or its gesture norms encode racial biases, then participants may be inadvertently socialized into patterns of exclusion or demeaning treatment. Conversely, VR also offers the possibility to reframe representation in constructive, even transformative ways, to create spaces for minority voices to tell their stories with unprecedented immediacy, to experiment with narratively rich, anti-stereotypical representations, to design consent and safety features that empower historically marginalized communities to participate on their own terms. The work of design, governance, and curation in these spaces is not mere interface engineering. It is a form of political action that can either entrench old hierarchies or chip away at them. The ethics of simulated actions is a parallel frontier. In VR, you can punch, strike, injure, or even kill a simulated body. Some experiences invite users to perform acts of harm in order to cultivate moral insight or to document the consequences of violence from a first-person perspective. Others present harrowing testimonials, immersive Holocaust simulations, or refugee journeys that place you inside someone else's dread, hunger, and peril. The moral intuitions that emerge from such experiences can be powerful. A better understanding of the fragility of life, a sense of collective responsibility, a felt imperative to prevent repetition of past atrocities. Yet such designs also raise concerns. Do intense immersive experiences manipulate emotions in ways that bypass reason, pressure moral judgments, or precipitate desensitization? Do they plus risk exploiting suffering for thrill or propaganda? The tension between moral education and emotional manipulation is not merely theoretical. It plays out in the design decisions of empathy-based VR projects. Let us now anchor these reflections in practical terrain with two modes of real-world application. First, VR empathy experiments and narrative simulations designed to promote moral insight. In the realm of immersive journalism and humanitarian storytelling, VR has become a distinct instrument for moral education. Consider immersive Holocaust experiences or refugee narratives crafted for public education and advocacy. The aim is not to entertain, the aim is to catalyze moral imagination. Immersion can be a catalyst for recognizing the shared vulnerability of human beings, to sense the precarity of life under oppression, and to cultivate a sense of responsibility that extends beyond the headset. When a viewer steps into the shoes of a persecuted person, the argument goes, reason alone may not suffice to generate compassion. The body's felt experience can cross the threshold that belief cannot. The ethical labor here involves multiple layers: the fidelity and ethics of representation, the consent and agency of participants, the dignity and perspective of those represented, and the broader social commitments that follow from heightened empathy. These projects raise critical questions about consent, about the potential for re-traumatization, about the boundaries of vicarious experience, and about the responsibilities of filmmakers, journalists, and platform owners to moderate, contextualize, and debrief. Second, there are contentious uses in VR social spaces: harassment, harmful content, and the creation of hostile environments. The same tools that can enable profound empathy can also enable humiliation, doxing, do harm through targeted harassment, or the replication of real-world power dynamics in new and more intimate ways. The ethics here demand careful governance, clear codes of conduct, robust reporting mechanisms, and design features that prevent or mitigate abuse. It is not enough to rely on virtue or intention alone. The architecture of a platform, the defaults for privacy, the immediacy and visibility of one's actions, the capacity to mute, block, or ban, must be shaped to protect participants' safety and dignity. In some cases, the material consequences of virtual actions are not merely symbolic. Harassment can cause real psychological harm, reinforce trauma, and chill participation, particularly for historically marginalized communities. This is not a trivial concern. It must inform every stage of design, policy, and community management. but we should also press into the counterarguments with equal seriousness. Counterargument 1 is that immersive experiences may manipulate emotions or desensitize users. The very force of immersion can create a sense of moral pressure that overrides reflective judgment. When you inhabit an intensely intimate space, the voice, the gaze, the embodied sensation, the brain may re-encode moral risk in ways that prioritize felt understanding over deliberative reflection. If a VR narrative is designed to produce catharsis or a particular political conclusion, there is a danger that we become instruments of persuasion rather than autonomous moral agents capable of critical evaluation. Skeptics argue that such mechanisms risk instrumentalizing suffering or flattening diverse experiences into a single didactic arc. There is a legitimate worry about the ethical integrity of simulations that aim to elicit sympathy not through shared humanity, but through staged intensity, shock value, or proprietary emotional contagion algorithms. Counterargument 2 concerns representation and misrepresentation of diverse identities. If avatars are used to represent race, gender, or other social identities, designers carry enormous responsibility for accuracy, context, and consent. When a platform defaults to particular cultural scripts or visual stereotypes, it can marginalize or distort real communities, reproduce harmful norms, or trigger misrecognition and harm. Furthermore, the ability to change what one looks like, swapping race or gender, poses its own ethical quandaries. Does such flexibility democratize identity, or does it encourage voyeurism, exploitation, or superficial engagement with social categories? Critics worry about the commodification of identity, the risk that identity performance becomes a form of entertainment rather than a serious social practice, and the potential for those with power to deploy avatars in ways that reinforce domination or exclusion. These issues intersect with AI ethics because the way a system interprets, processes, and responds to avatars, recognition, bias, recommendation, surveillance, has direct moral implications. They also intersect with bioethics, insofar as questions of consent, bodily integrity, and the dignity of embodied experience become analogs in digital form. Historical anecdotes can illuminate these discussions by showing how these debates have emerged and evolved. First, consider the early ethical debates surrounding digital avatars. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as cyberspace and online communities grew, scholars and practitioners asked whether digital beings should be accorded rights, protections, or a form of personhood. There were lively conversations about parasocial relationships, about the ethical status of virtual property, about consent to representation, and about accountability for avatar-driven harm, even when the real person behind the screen remained unknown or dispersed. Some argued that the avatar, though digital, claims a social presence that deserves moral consideration. Others warned that to grant moral status to avatars would blur lines of responsibility in ways that politics and law were not yet prepared to handle. The debates were less about technical feasibility and more about the moral grammar of identity, agency, and responsibility in early digital ecologies. A second anecdote centers on the emergence of VR social platforms in the 2010s. Platforms like VR Chat, AltSpace VR, and later Social Spaces on Oculus and other devices transformed virtual reality from a niche research lab into a social playground. In these spaces, people gathered to chat, play games, build environments, and enact social experiments in ways that often mirrored, challenged, or reimagined offline norms. The conversations about consent, safety, and community governance intensified as the user base grew more diverse, and as the novelty of immersion wore off to reveal deeper structural questions. Who gets to set the norms? How do we prevent abuse without stifling creativity? How do we protect children and vulnerable users while preserving freedom of expression? These are not abstract questions for historians. They were active governance challenges, with real-life consequences for people's sense of belonging and safety in digital communities. A third anecdote highlights notable public demonstrations of empathy-based VR projects. Consider immersive reporting projects that place viewers inside the lives of refugees or victims of conflict. Immersive journalism has produced powerful reactions. A sense of the immediacy of hunger, fear, displacement, and the fragility of social bonds under duress. These experiences cultivate a kind of moral presence that can be more compelling than traditional reportage alone. But they also raise questions about consent, representation, and ethical framing. Whose voices are foregrounded, what narratives are chosen, what is the risk of voyeurism, what are the responsibilities to those portrayed to ensure dignity and accuracy. In parallel, Holocaust simulations have been used in museums, classrooms, and public exhibitions to evoke a visceral sense of history. The ethical stakes in these experiences are high. What does it mean to invite people to experience atrocity? To what extent is that appropriate or respectful? And what is the ultimate aim, memory, accountability, or policy change? These public demonstrations test the boundary between moral education and entertainment, between commemoration and spectacle, and between empathy and sensationalism. Against these currents, we maintain the cross-references that connect VR ethics to broader domains. AI ethics, for example, offers crucial insights about algorithmic fairness, accountability, and the governance of autonomous agents within virtual environments. If an avatar's actions are mediated by AI behaviors that learn from user interactions, then the moral responsibility for those actions becomes distributed across designers, platforms, and the system itself. The politics of representation in digital media, how media shapes our sense of who belongs, who is seen, who is privileged, also flows directly into VR. The way avatars are depicted, who gets to appear, and how consent is obtained are not merely technical concerns but political ones. Bioethics supplies a useful analog. Questions about consent, bodily integrity, and harm in VR map onto familiar bioethical debates about autonomy, risk, and the vulnerability of the human body, even as the body in VR may be virtual or embedded in biometric sensing. The ethics of representation in VR must also be read through the lens of social justice. Whose stories are told, whose experiences are validated, whose voices are amplified, and who remains invisible or misrepresented. In the longest view, VR challenges us to rethink what we owe to others in a world where the line between fiction and reality grows increasingly porous. If Aristotle teaches that virtue is a habit cultivated through practice, and if Kant asks us to honor the humanity of rational agents, then VR asks us to practice virtue in a space where the consequences of practice can be immediate, measurable, and scalable. If Hume reminds us that sympathy is a powerful engine of moral life, then immersive experiences become laboratories for nurturing or suppressing that sympathy, precisely because they intensify our capacity to imagine another's pain or joy. If Butler reminds us that identity is performed, not fixed, then the avatar becomes a site of ethical experimentation about what kinds of bodies, genders, and identities we sanction as normative or permitted, and which we challenge as oppressive. If Turkle warns us that technology changes who we are, then the infant phase of VR, where people first discover what it means to inhabit a body different from their own, becomes a crucial moment to shape character and norms that will echo into offline life. If Floridi insists that information ethics governs the moral life of digital ecosystems, then the data flows, surveillance, consent, and accountability structures become central to any normative account of VR. Let us extend the arc by looking at modern interpretations and practical implications, tying the theory back to lived experience. In contemporary VR design, there is a tension between immersion and responsibility. Designers must consider not only how to create convincing experiences, but also how to embed safeguards that prevent harm and promote learning. This involves rethinking consent in multi-layered ways. Immediate in-the-moment consent for interactions, long-term consent regarding data practices and the persistence of one's digital traces, and community consent in terms of shared norms and governance. It also requires a robust understanding of power dynamics within virtual spaces. Who can enter, who can set the rules, who is heard, and who is silenced? These are not peripheral questions. They define the moral texture of the entire VR ecosystem. Consider the ethical load of avatar embodiment in cross-cultural contexts. A user may choose to inhabit a persona that bears a particular cultural symbol, religious sign, or historically loaded aesthetic. The meaning and ethical weight of those choices depend on context, intention, and audience interpretation. This is where Butler's performativity intersects with Floridi's information ethics. The act of presenting a particular identity is a data-driven action with social consequences, and the meaning produced is co-constructed by the platform's policies, other users' responses, and the cultural script in which the interaction is embedded. The responsibility is collective. A platform cannot be neutral if it provides tools that enable or normalize harmful behavior, nor can a designer escape accountability by citing user freedom alone. Yet there is also space for transformative experimentation, for communities to create new norms, to experiment with forms of recognition, to recalibrate consent and consent-related power, and to foster a climate where empathy is cultivated through shared vulnerability rather than coerced by spectacle. In parallel, the moral language of VR must contend with the possibility of misrepresentation. When users claim identities in ways that may erase the complexities of lived experiences or dramatize trauma for entertainment, ethical warnings come into focus. This is not a call to halt innovation, but a call to steward representation with care, to involve communities, to source meaningful input from people whose identities are at stake, to ensure that narratives avoid sensationalism, and to build in mechanisms for accountability. A Floridian perspective on information ethics would insist that the ethics of representation includes not only how stories are told, but who has the right to tell them, who can control the data that map those stories, and who bears responsibility when the narratives shape the public imagination in harmful ways. Cross-references to AI ethics deepen the analysis. If virtual characters are augmented by AI that can learn, adapt, and respond to human behavior, we should ask, what is the limit of machine autonomy in spaces designed for human-to-human interaction? How do we ensure transparency about when we are interacting with an AI agent versus a human? How do we design systems to respect human autonomy while still enabling meaningful, responsive, and humane interactions? The GDPR and related legal frameworks offer a model for privacy by design, but VR adds layers of simulated identity and persistent data that challenge existing regulatory categories. The question becomes, can there be a robust governance framework that aligns with Kantian duties to treat individuals as ends in themselves, while incorporating Floridi's emphasis on the informational character of moral life? The answer is not a simple yes or no. It is a call for layered, context-sensitive governance that combines technical safeguards, normative principles, and community-led norms. We should also consider the bioethical analogies, the body in VR as a locus of vulnerability and consent. Even though the body is not physically present in the same way as in offline life, the experience of embodiment, a sense of being in a body with limits, capabilities, and susceptibilities, belies any claim that VR ethics can ignore the material. The potential for pain, discomfort, nausea, or long-term effects on mental health requires a careful calculus of risk, benefit, and duty of care. If a VR experience causes distress or triggers trauma, who is responsible for providing support, for offering opt-out options, or for ensuring that users can disengage safely? The meta-coethical concept of non-maleficence, do no harm, enters the VR arena in a practical sense. It calls for thorough risk assessments, explicit consent for immersive content, and post-experience debriefing that helps participants integrate what they have seen into the rest of their lives with psychological safety. Within this philosophical frame, there are two kinds of practical examples worth exploring in depth. The first is VR empathy experiments and narrative simulations designed to promote moral insight. Immersive Holocaust experiences, refugee journeys, and other deeply human stories told through the felt presence of the viewer. What makes these experiences ethically compelling is their capacity to place the viewer inside another's life, bodily sensation, spatial awareness, situational cues, and a narrative arc that invites viewers to reconstruct the ethical landscape from a different vantage point. The ethical stakes here are high. Representation accuracy, consent of those depicted, sensitivity to trauma survivors, and a commitment to avoid exploitation for sensational impact. The pedagogical aim is to cultivate moral insight, not to weaponize emotion. The virtue of the exercise makes sense in light of Aristotle's insistence that virtue is cultivated through habituation to the right kind of responses, but a VR design that repeatedly elicits fear or sorrow without offering a path to constructive action could risk moral fatigue or cynicism. The second practical mode concerns contentious uses such as harassment or harmful content in VR social spaces. We must be honest about the fact that a platform that invites people to gather in a shared virtual world will inevitably encounter the full spectrum of human behavior, some compassionate, some cruel. The ethical design question is not whether to prevent harm, but how to manage it effectively without stifling legitimate exploration, expression, and sociability. From a Kantian perspective, we must provide rules that ensure we do not convert others into mere means to our own satisfaction. From a Humean lens, we must nurture the conditions that awaken genuine sympathy rather than call forth cruelty. From Butler's view, we must guard against erasing or trivializing identities by misusing performativity for harm. And from Floridi's frame, we must handle data and representation with accountability and respect. The challenge is to create environments where people can learn from one another, challenge one another, and grow together, while maintaining a robust safety architecture that protects the vulnerable and holds wrongdoers to account. To give a sense of how these debates look in the wild, we can reflect on historical anecdotes that illuminate the path VR ethics has traveled. The first concerns early digital avatars and the debates about personhood and responsibility. In forums that predate modern VR headsets, avatars were abstract and their moral status was contested. Were they mere tools, or did they carry a kind of moral weight because they enabled social interactions with real-world consequences? The discourse in these early discussions foreshadowed later questions. If your avatar commits harm in a game, who bears responsibility? The user, the platform, or the designer of the space? The conversation also explored whether users should have rights regarding their digital likenesses, how to manage copyright over avatar designs, and how to ensure consent when avatars are transferred across platforms. The emergence of VR social platforms in the 2010s offered a second historical hinge. As social VR gained traction, public discourse about ethics in these environments shifted from speculative to urgent. People began to experience firsthand the fragility and potential of collective virtual life, the sense of presence, the immediacy of others' reactions, the ability to shape shared spaces with tangible impact. Then came the challenges, the emergence of harassment, the persistence of problematic norms, and the demands for better governance. The lessons from these years include the importance of community standards, the necessity of cross-platform interoperability to avoid jurisdiction shopping by abusers, and the value of designing with safety in mind from the earliest stages rather than treating it as an afterthought. A notable feature of VR's maturation has been public demonstrations and projects intended to cultivate empathy. Immersive experiences that place audiences in the lives of others, be they refugees, Holocaust survivors, or patients living with chronic illness, have proven to be powerful, sometimes transformative. They can shift perspectives, challenge entrenched biases, and stimulate political action. Yet they also illustrate the delicate balance we must strike, the demands of respectful representation, the risk of re-traumatization, and the moral obligation to avoid instrumentalizing someone's pain for a narrative payoff. These projects, while not the only path to moral insight, also remind us that empathy is not a guarantee of justice. It can motivate action, but it must be paired with structural commitments. Policy changes, social accountability, and ongoing education about how to translate empathetic understanding into real-world care and reform. In connecting these histories to ongoing debates, we must not lose sight of cross-disciplinary dialogues. The ethics of VR invites dialogue with AI ethics, since intelligent agents, whether designed to shape behavior, mediate interactions, or guide narratives in VR, play a growing role in shaping the moral climate of virtual spaces. It invites dialogue with bioethics as we consider bodily safety, consent, and the moral stakes of immersive experiences that involve the body, even if only virtually. It engages with the politics of representation in digital media, challenging creators and communities to attend to who is present, whose stories are told, and who profit from or are harmed by such representations. These cross-references are not merely academic. They offer practical guardrails, design principles that foreground consent and safety, governance models that distribute accountability, and normative commitments that resist reducing people to categories or experiences to sensations. With these considerations in mind, a practical blueprint emerges for thinking about ethics, identity, and agency in VR. It begins with the recognition that the moral life in a virtual space is inseparable from the moral life offline. The virtues we cultivate inside a headset, empathy, restraint, respect for boundaries, and readiness to listen, must be mirrored by our external actions. How we advocate for policies that protect participants, how we design systems that promote inclusion rather than exploitation, and how we engage with communities to ensure that their voices guide representations and narratives. It also requires humility, the understanding that VR is a rapidly evolving field, with new capabilities, new risks, and new possibilities to either heal or harm. The demand on us is to remain attentive to the ethical dimensions of each design choice, each narrative arc, and each policy decision, not to surrender to a fear that paralyzes innovation, but to meet the challenge with a robust, reflective, and principled approach. If we step back and listen to what the voices of great thinkers tell us, we discover a disciplined openness to the complexities of VR. Kant's insistence on universalizability pushes us to ask whether a particular action inside VR would be acceptable if it became a common practice for everyone. Aristotle's virtue ethics invites us to cultivate habits of consent, habits of listening, habits of respect that persist beyond a single session. Hume's emphasis on sympathy reminds us that moral life arises from our capacity to resonate with others' feelings, while Butler's performativity invites us to scrutinize how identities are made and unmade in real time, through the very tools we choose to use. Turkle's warning about technology's transformative power presses us to be mindful of how VR reshapes our sense of self and our capacity for authentic connection. Bostrom's simulation argument orients us toward existential questions. What kind of worlds do we want to create, and what obligations arise toward the minds that might inhabit them? Floridi's information ethics grounds these debates in a practical framework for governing data, consent, accountability, and the rights of information subjects. In sum, the ethics of VR is not a single theory or a single policy. It is a living, ongoing conversation about how we want to live with others inside the most intimate and powerful forms of human technological collaboration we have devised. The questions are urgent because the consequences of our choices in VR are real, even if the medium is virtual. When we design an avatar, when we stage a narrative, when we regulate a space, we are negotiating who we are becoming and what kind of society we want to share. The task is not to banish discomfort or to pretend that all experiences within VR are ethically neutral. The task is to cultivate discernment, an ability to see how a design choice may advance justice or create harm, how a narrative might illuminate a truth about human dignity or obscure it behind sensationalism, how a platform's governance might empower the vulnerable or expose them to new forms of risk. As we continue to explore the ethics of VR, let us keep a gaze toward the horizon where the lines between the virtual and the real become increasingly blurred. Let us hold close the legacies of Aristotle and Kant as we learn from contemporary voices like Turkle and Butler, and let Floridi remind us that information, not merely bodies, sits at the center of moral life in these spaces. Let us be mindful of the power of embodiment to transform how we care for others, but also conscious of the limits of immersion if it inflames prejudice or legitimizes harm. Let us insist on empathy that is not merely felt, but seen in deeds, policies enacted, communities protected, stories told with respect and accountability. If we can cultivate that kind of moral literacy in VR, one that respects the dignity of every participant, that seeks to widen the circle of concern rather than contract it, that holds technology to the highest ethical standards while encouraging fearless inquiry, then the philosophy of virtual reality offers not a retreat from the world, but a deeper invitation to engage it with wisdom. We will still ask hard questions, and we will still wrestle with profound tensions. But we can pursue those questions with the confidence that we are building not only immersive experiences, but better ways of living together. And in doing so, perhaps we can honor the truth at the heart of philosophy, that the measure of a life and the measure of a community is how we respond to others when we could easily forget them, how we treat those who appear different, how we design spaces in which every voice is heard, and how we steward the moral imagination in times of rapid change. Let us close with a few guiding lines, drawn from the thinkers who illuminate this path. Kant reminds us that our actions must be chosen not for their immediate payoff, but for their capacity to become universal laws. Aristotle reminds us that virtue is cultivated through practice, by choosing the good in repeated, small acts that culminate in character. Hume reminds us that sympathy is a social glue, the moral sentiment that binds us across distances and differences. Butler reminds us that identity is performative, that the power to be seen is a political power, and that the ethics of representation is not incidental but central. Turkle reminds us that technology shapes who we are, and we ought to be mindful of the psychosocial transformations we invite into our lives. Bostrom reminds us that the possibility of simulations raises existential duties to consider what worlds we create and what it means to be a moral agent within them. Floridi reminds us that information ethics must govern how data, access, consent, and responsibility intersect in digital ecosystems. If in listening to these voices, we find a map that helps us navigate the moral terrain of VR, we will have accomplished something significant. Not merely to argue about what is permissible in virtual worlds, but to commit to responsibilities that extend to the real lives that intersect with those worlds. We will have learned to balance wonder with restraint, curiosity with care, freedom with accountability. We will have learned to ask not only what VR can do, but what VR ought to do and who it ought to serve. This is the ethical horizon of the philosophy of virtual reality, a horizon that invites, challenges, and hopefully guides us toward a future in which the most immersive technologies amplify the best of human moral potential rather than the worst. And so we return to the core inquiry with renewed resolve. When we enter a VR space, we step onto a stage where the drama of human life unfolds in a new register. It is a stage that asks for courage, humility, and a disciplined imagination. It asks us to practice virtue in the company of others who look back at us with their own digital faces and real lives behind them. It asks us to design, to regulate, to teach, and to listen in ways that honor the dignity of every participant, whether that participant is a human being or a data stream that represents a life. It asks us to keep faith with the best of philosophical traditions while holding the new technologies to the highest standards of moral accountability. In doing so, we might together realize a vision of virtual reality as not merely a space of simulation, but a space of meaning, learning, and ethical growth, where empathy can illuminate the path, not simply illuminate the screen. If you strap on a headset and step into a virtual world, you might expect to leave the sticky doors of the old world behind you. But what if the new metaverse you enter is not so much an escape as a map of who dominates what? What if the spaces we inhabit in virtual reality are not merely games or escapist playgrounds, but nodes in a vast political economy, tethered to data flows, labor relations, and governance structures that shape not just what we can do there, but who we become in the process? The section you're listening to now is an invitation to walk slowly through those questions. We're going to look at the philosophy of virtual reality not as a purely technical achievement, but as a social, political, and economic instrument, one that is entangled with power, sovereignty, and the duties we owe to each other as digital subjects and citizens. To begin, let us situate VR not as a detached gadget, but as a hinge between worlds, between the material infrastructures that carry content and the symbolic orders that endow that content with meaning. VR is a technology of immersion, yes, but it is also a technology of organization. It has a capacity to shape perception, yes, but it also has a capacity to shape aspiration, labor, and law. If we ask what it means to live under platform capitalism in a VR era, we must ask what kinds of bodies and behaviors that capitalism seeks to enlist, how it coordinates with state and non-state actors, and what kinds of futures it promises or threatens to produce. The aim of this segment is to unfold those layers with care, to examine origins, thinkers, arguments, counterarguments, historical anecdotes, and concrete examples that illuminate the political economy of VR. We will cross-reference ideas from Shoshana Zuboff about surveillance capitalism, from Tiziana Terranova about free labor on networks, and from Bruno Latter's actor network theory, while also engaging with Mitchell Foucault's enduring analysis of power and surveillance. We will keep a steady eye on practical implications, data sovereignty, privacy, labor dynamics, and governance, so that this exploration does not stay in the cloud of abstractions, but remains tethered to real-world consequences and possibilities. Let us begin by tracing the origins of a shift that VR sits squarely within, the ascent of platform architectures and the transformation of digital experience into infrastructural capital. VR hardware, software, and platforms did not appear in a vacuum. They emerged within a long arc of consumer tech where the value of a service increasingly lies not in a single product sold once, but in ongoing access to data, attention, and network effects. If we want to understand the political economy of VR, we must begin with the way modern platforms monetize presence. Data as the fuel, attention as the engine, and the affordances of immersive interfaces as the field upon which advertising, microtransactions, and service tiers are contested. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, the dream of immersive digital spaces began to crystallize in earnest. The development of more capable headsets, more sophisticated motion tracking, and more powerful engines made plausible the vision of shared, interactive environments that feel nearly tangible. But the commercial inflection point arrives with the ascent of platform capitalism, the idea that a handful of corporate ecosystems will host the central arenas where users gather, produce content, socialize, and transact. This is not simply about selling headsets or software. It is about owning the gateways through which millions of people meet, collaborate, and generate value. The metaverse, as many platforms now describe it, is less a singular line of software and more a networked project. A coalition of devices, apps, servers, creator tools, and policy regimes that together shape user experiences and, importantly, shape incentives for participation. If we pause to reflect on Shoshana Zuboff's diagnosis, we can hear a warning whistle. Surveillance capitalism turns human experience into raw material for translation into predictive data about behavior. It treats the most intimate, spontaneous, and emergent dimensions of life as data points to be harvested, refined, and monetized. In VR, this transformation happens in new and intensified forms. We are no longer simply observing users. We are streaming their gaze, their head movements, their locomotion vectors, their voice signals, their biometric feedback, and even the tempo of their interactions with others. In a platform-driven VR environment, the line between content and data becomes blurry. Every gesture can become a data point, every avatar motion can be mapped for pattern recognition, and every social exchange can be indexed to refine recommendations, predictions, and advertising profiles. The result is not merely an interface for entertainment or work. It is a living data pipeline that converts lived experience into market intelligence. To put some imagination to it, consider a concrete contemporary example. A large platform building a multi-world virtual ecosystem and narrating a grand metaverse project with the language of universal access and shared experience. Meta, formerly Facebook, has invested in VR not as a niche product, but as a cornerstone of its long-run vision of social computing. Horizon Worlds and related platforms operate as layered ecosystems, developer tools, social spaces, and monetized experiences where users can create, share, and transact. The ambition is to create a ubiquitous platform-defined virtual society where user-generated content becomes a revenue stream, creators monetize their labor, and advertisers reach audiences in more intimate, immersive formats. In such a world, data mastery becomes a central strategic asset. Who controls the platform's data pipelines, how data is collected and processed, and how design choices steer user behavior toward desired outcomes, such as longer session lengths, more interactions, or higher value purchases. When we read about Horizon Worlds or similar initiatives, we are not just seeing a new form of entertainment. We are witnessing the social architecture of a digital sovereign space, where sovereignty is negotiated in terms of platform terms of service, privacy policies, and terms that grant broad rights to data collection and use. This is precisely the terrain Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. VR intensifies the logic of capturing behavioral data by incorporating near-embodied interactions into the data calculus. The headset itself becomes a data gateway, collecting information about where you look, how you move, what catches your attention, and how you respond to social stimuli. The platform then translates this material into predictive models that can guide what you see, what you experience next, and what you are offered to purchase. The data is not merely about ads. It powers optimization algorithms, content curation, and the design of new features that maximize engagement and retention. In some sense, the VR experience becomes a feedback loop. The platform gains more data, the platform refines the experience to generate more data, and the user becomes a data-producing subject whose choices and preferences are increasingly shaped by the platform's inferences and nudges. As Zuboff argues, this is not a neutral byproduct. It represents a reorganized economy in which central profits come from the governance of attention and the extraction of behavioral futures. If we bring in Ladder's actor network theory, we can expand this analysis to consider how VR's political economy emerges from a convergence of humans and non-humans. The designers, the policy teams, the servers, the data centers, the headsets, the code, the moderation bots, the currency mechanisms, and the avatars themselves. The world of VR is not simply created by people. It is assembled through a network of actants, each translating interests into configurations. In Ladder's terms, every element in this network seeks to stabilize a set of relations. For example, a moderation policy that translates into trust and safety norms translates into user behavior. A currency mechanism translates into labor value for creators. A device's hardware constraints translate into design decisions. The network is a living system of negotiations, and the power in this system is distributed across different actors, not held by a single owner. Yet the distribution is asymmetrical. The platform operators on the key nodes of the network, the app stores, the payment rails, the data infrastructure, and thus exercise considerable capacity to set agendas, shape regulations, and restructure how labor and content are valued. Ant invites us to look at the entire constellation and ask, who benefits from these translations and who bears the risks? We must also bring in Tiziana Terranova's provocative claim about free labor on the networks. In VR, as in other digital ecosystems, the labor of users and creators is often positioned as a gift or a communal contribution to a system that returns some mutual benefit in the form of access or visibility. Terranova's argument that free labor underwrites the digital economy resonates with VR's dynamics. Creators who design virtual goods, world builders who craft immersive experiences, moderators who enforce community standards, and testers who provide feedback, all are contributing labor without direct monetary compensation in the traditional sense. Even when there is payment, Linden dollars in Second Life or creator payouts in certain VR marketplaces, the value captured by the platform can be disproportionately large relative to the compensation and protections afforded to many workers. The concept of free labor helps us to see how the VR economy can reproduce or intensify existing power relations. Those who own the platforms reap outsized profit, while many users and creators trade time, attention, and skills for access, exposure, or a modest share of revenue. That is not to deny that VR can democratize access to experiences and knowledge. There are powerful counterarguments that push back against a simplistic fatalism about platform capitalism. One line of thought suggests VR can democratize access to education, culture, and professional opportunities in new ways. For people with mobility constraints, chronic illness, or geographic isolation, VR could lower the barriers to highly specialized training, simulated practice, or immersive cultural experiences. Pioneering projects in VR healthcare, disaster response training, or remote collaboration illustrate how immersive environments can provide practical benefits that would be harder to realize in the physical world. If we frame this as a possibility rather than a guarantee, we can ask, under what conditions would VR expand opportunities without intensifying surveillance and exploitation? What kinds of governance structures or community norms would be necessary to ensure that benefits are broad-based rather than captured by a few platform owners? A second counterargument centers on environmental considerations. In some contexts, VR can reduce the need for physical travel, thereby lowering carbon footprints associated with commuting, business travel, and conferences. If VR-enabled meetings replace long-haul flights or reduce the energy intensities of large-scale events, then the technology could contribute to environmental goals. Yet this argument is not straightforward. The energy footprint of data centers, networks, and high-end headsets is non-trivial. The environmental assessment must compare the life cycle costs of VR experiences against the alternatives, and it must account for rebound effects. Convenience can lead to more consumption, longer engagement, and new forms of digital infrastructure investment. The point is not to condemn VR outright as unsustainable, but to insist that environmental claims be subjected to rigorous, transparent life cycle analyses, and that policies guide the development toward more efficient, renewable-powered, and privacy-conscious practices. As we move from theory toward history, two historical anecdotes illuminate the shifting terrain of consumer VR and proto-metaverse experiments that helped seed today's debates about governance, labor, and digital sovereignty. First, the rise of consumer VR hardware and the platform shifts that accompanied it. A pivotal moment came with the Oculus acquisition by Facebook in 2014. The Oculus Rift, born from a Kickstarter campaign that captured the public imagination, became a focal point for the industry's hopes about consumer-ready immersive technology. The purchase by Facebook signaled not simply a strategic investment in hardware, but a commitment to a broader platform strategy. VR would not be a standalone gadget, but a conduit into a social ecosystem anchored by a dominant social network. The aftershocks were many: platform governance decisions about what content could be monetized in VR spaces, how data would be collected from headset sensors and motion controllers, and how developers would be compensated. The subsequent evolution Rift, then the Quest line, and the broader pivot toward a unified metaverse vision, reframed VR as a social infrastructure with corporate stewardship of the central metaverse rails. These shifts illuminate a tension that persists. The potential for VR to democratize experience resides alongside the possibility that control of the infrastructures and data will be concentrated in a few corporate hands. The second anecdote harkens back to the hopeful, messy era of proto-metaverse experiments in early online virtual worlds, notably Second Life. Launched in 2003 by Linden Lab, Second Life offered a living laboratory for the social and economic dimensions of virtual life long before contemporary metaverse discourse. In Second Life, you could own land, design products, host events, and engage in what economist Dana Boyd would later describe as the emergence of real, economic activity in a simulated world. The platform created a genuine economy centered on the Linden dollar, which could be exchanged for real-world currency. It was a space where people established identities through avatars, built shops and galleries, and formed communities with their own norms, governance structures, and disputes to adjudicate. The social and economic experiments of Second Life demonstrated that digital labor could be monetized, that identity economies could flourish, and that governance, through terms of service, user councils, and community moderation, could shape the social fabric of a virtual world. Yet the Second Life era also exposed vulnerabilities: capital concentration around platform owners, the fragility of in-world economies to external shocks, and the challenges of scalable governance in a sprawling, user-generated environment. Those early experiments provide a crucial prehistory to the present conversation about VR labor, digital sovereignty, and platform power. Within this historical and theoretical frame, a few cross-cutting themes emerge that help bind the threads of origin, power, and possibility. One is the question of governance and censorship in digital spaces. If the VR worlds we inhabit are increasingly governed by platform policies, terms of service, and moderation practices, what does it mean to have political agency within those spaces? Foucault's master narrative about surveillance and power offers a lens to understand how governance is exercised not only through overt coercion, but through the micro-techniques of discipline, normalization, and behavioral shaping. In VR, this can mean how visibility in an avatar-mediated space becomes the scaffolding for social acceptance and social control. The panopticon is no longer a tower. It is the architecture of an immersive system that makes users feel observed, guided, and steered towards certain behaviors, all within a frame designed to maximize engagement, data generation, and monetization. The instrument of government in VR is not only the state's reach, but the platform's reach, the design of the user interface, the labeling of acceptable content, and the rules about how to monetize virtual labor. Ladder's Ant remains a powerful waypoint for understanding how these governance arrangements come into being. The VR ecosystem is a network in which devices, algorithms, servers, currency schemes, content guidelines, and creative practices all translate their interests into a stabilized arrangement. The headset sensor suite, the cloud's processing power, the governance policies of a platform, and the creativity of a user all have a stake in what the space becomes. If a platform refuses to allow certain kinds of expression or restricts monetization in certain territories, those choices ripple through the network, altering who can participate, what kinds of labor are incentivized, and how identity is performed within the space. The question of digital sovereignty arises here. Who claims the right to define, moderate, and monetize the experiences of VR users? Is sovereignty a property of the platform, the state, the community, or some hybrid of these actors, mediated by contractual terms that can be modified at the platform's discretion? Let us anchor these reflections with two more concrete examples that illuminate the complexities of VR's political economy. The first example concerns the metaverse ambitions of large platforms and their data practices. Consider how a platform such as Meta frames its VR ambitions. A suite of immersive environments, social channels, and development tools designed to keep users within a single ecosystem, while harvesting telemetry that reveals the most intimate patterns of attention, preference, and social behavior. The data practices unfold in several layers: device-level data from the headset and controllers, software-level data from the VR applications, and network-level data from interactions across immersive spaces. The platform's advertising and monetization logic extends into social VR in ways that are more intimate than traditional web advertising. When you're inside a virtual space that responds to your gaze, your posture, your proximity to others, and your ephemeral actions, such as where you choose to stand in a scene, which objects you pick up, or which avatars you invite into a private space, these micro-interactions compose a rich portrait of your preferences and vulnerabilities. The data is not merely used to target an ad. It is used to optimize the entire experience for longer engagement, more replicable social patterns, and more precise recommendation systems. The policy architecture that governs what is collected, how long it is stored, who can access it, and how it can be used for training algorithms is an essential site of power. From a Terranovan perspective, we observe that this VR data regime rests on a premise of free labor embedded in user participation. The platform invites creators to invest time and talent into building spaces, scripting interactions, designing virtual goods, and moderating communities, often with the promise of visibility, reputation, or a share of revenue. But the profits and governance are still centralized in the platform, and the costs, privacy risks, the potential for coercive design, and the long-term risk of dependency are borne by the workers who contribute the labor. This is not a simple critique of a handful of bad actors. It is a structural observation about the way online labor is organized and valorized within a broader networked economy. The platform becomes both a stage for creativity and a gatekeeper, shaping which kinds of labor are rewarded and how much of its value is returned to those who perform it. It is a vivid illustration of the speed with which the digital economy can turn social interaction into an industrial activity, with the price of participation being the surrender of some measure of privacy, autonomy, or even a degree of control over one's own data. The second example concerns real-world VR communities that illustrate digital labor and identity economies in more down-to-earth settings. Consider VR Chat, a social VR platform that has grown into a vibrant ecosystem of avatars, worlds, events, and social rituals. In VR Chat, people do not simply consume experiences, they design them, host them, and curate communities. Content creation is a form of labor, building a world, scripting interactions, designing wearables and avatars, moderating chat streams, and maintaining spaces that attract participants. Some of this labor is monetized through creator programs, sponsorships, or in-world economies. Much of it remains unpaid or underpaid, while the platform collects data about how people use these spaces, what features are popular, and how to optimize retention. The result is a microcosm of the broader critique. Identity economies, how people craft avatars, brands, and personas, are deeply interwoven with labor, value, and surveillance. Identity becomes a resource, traded in a market where social value is converted into real-world opportunity or compensation, depending on the platform's rules and the creator's ability to navigate them. Second Life, an earlier archetypal proto-metaverse, offers another instructive mirror. In its heyday, Second Life's economy flourished with its own currency, the Linden dollar, which could be converted to US dollars. Users built stores, hosted events, offered services, and cultivated reputations that could translate into tangible income. The social fabric of Second Life was deeply shaped by user governance, with community norms and in-world rules evolving through collaboration, conflict, and experimentation. The platform demonstrated that digital labor could produce a robust, real-world lucrative economy, and that virtual spaces could become locations for social identity construction, entrepreneurship, and cultural production. Yet it also illustrated the precarity and fragility of such economies. The Linden dollar's exchange rate fluctuated, external economic pressures spilled into virtual markets, and governance issues, how to adjudicate disputes, how to police content, how to prevent fraud, required ongoing negotiation among users, corporate owners, and regulatory frameworks. In this sense, Second Life's history is a pedagogical map for contemporary VR communities, a demonstration that immersive spaces can host thriving labor and identity economies, while also warning about governance challenges, the vulnerability of digital currencies to shocks, and the asymmetries of power in platform-controlled infrastructures. Both examples bring into focus the question of digital sovereignty, a term that captures the struggle over who controls data, spaces, and rules in the digital world. Digital sovereignty is not merely a technical issue of where data is stored. It is a political question about who has the authority to determine the terms of access, the boundaries of censorship, and the rights of users to control their own representations and labor. When a platform operates with a centralized data regime and a consolidated governance architecture, sovereignty is, in effect, reallocated from individuals to the platform. Ladder's framework helps us see how sovereignty is negotiated through continuous translations. The platform translates user needs into product features. Advertisers translate consent into targeted outreach. State actors translate privacy norms into compliance requirements, and users translate policy terms into lived, practical acceptance or resistance. Sovereignty in VR thus emerges as a negotiated artifact within a network of actors, where the balance of power is constantly shifting as technologies evolve and political economic interests realign. Let us now consider two powerful counterarguments with care, recognizing that the story is not monolithic and that VR's social and political character can be reframed in more hopeful directions. First, the democratization argument. Proponents argue that VR can widen access to experiences, education, and expert knowledge by removing physical barriers. Imagine a world-class artist offering a VR gallery that anyone with a headset can visit at any time, or an engineer in a remote region participating in a real-time virtual lab with scholars from around the world. In principle, VR can flatten geographical constraints, enable new forms of collaborative learning, and unlock opportunities for communities that have been traditionally marginalized by the constraints of physical access. It can foster empathy by placing individuals inside others' environments, offering experiences that might broaden sensibilities and cross-cultural understanding. The potential here is profound. A more inclusive cultural landscape, more diverse scientific collaboration, and more scalable forms of education that can adapt to different learning styles and needs. In this sense, VR could contribute to a more equitable distribution of knowledge and capability, provided that access remains widely available, privacy is protected, and labor is fairly compensated or recognized in proportion to its value. Second, the environmental argument. Some analysts suggest that VR could cut down on travel, reduce emissions, and lower the energy intensity of certain activities. Virtual meetings can substitute for long flights. Virtual conferences can democratize attendance by removing expensive travel and visa barriers. The sensory richness of VR promises a more immersive substitute for some forms of physical presence, which could translate into meaningful reductions in carbon footprints for specific use cases. Yet this optimistic outlook must be balanced with caution. VR's energy demands, the environmental footprint of massive data centers, hardware production, and the lifetime sustainability of headsets must be accounted for. The net environmental impact question is complex. We need to compare the full life cycles of VR versus conventional practices, consider rebound effects, and ask how to design systems that minimize waste and maximize recyclability. The point is not to abandon the promise of VR's potential benefits, but to insist that they be pursued in ways that are transparent, accountable, and aligned with broader social and ecological values. Two historical anecdotes revisit the interplay of power and possibility in VR's development. First, the Oculus acquisition and the platform shifts that followed mark a critical moment when consumer VR rose from an experimental fringe into a mainstream, investment-heavy enterprise. The Oculus Rift's origin story, born in a crowdfunding campaign, later acquired by a major corporate player, illustrates how a technological novelty can become a strategic lever in a broader program of platform expansion and data strategy. The acquisition did not simply bring a hardware line, it integrated VR into the corporate architecture of a data-driven platform economy. The subsequent era saw the bundling of VR with social networks, games, content marketplaces, and cloud services. The platform's design choices, monetization models, and governance rules began to shape the field in profound ways. The historical lesson here is that the politics of VR is inseparable from the commercial logic that accompanies it. The dream of a free, open, user-governed virtual world exists alongside the reality of corporate strategy, market power, and the extraction of value through data-intensive services. Second, the proto-metaverse experiments of early online virtual worlds, especially Second Life, provide a counterpoint to the modern corporate narrative. Second Life's economy, its community governance, its emphasis on user-generated content, and its real-world monetization demonstrated both the creative potential and the governance challenges of immersive spaces. The Linden Dollar and in world commerce showed that digital labor can yield genuine economic activity. Yet the experience also revealed the vulnerabilities of user-driven economies within a corporate framework. What happens when policy changes, revenue models shift, or platform ownership alters the incentives for creators and communities? This historical memory challenges the assumption that the VR future must be either fully corporate or completely independent. It invites us to imagine hybrids, where communities maintain a degree of autonomy while benefiting from scalable infrastructure, and where governance mechanisms allow for more resilient and equitable labor arrangements. If we consider the cross-references to governance, censorship, and digital sovereignty, the philosophical tether to Foucault's analysis becomes more explicit. Surveillance and power are not simply about catching wrongdoers. They are about shaping what is permissible, what is desirable, and what is considered normal within a given space. In VR, as in physical institutions, the power to define norms, to reward certain kinds of labor, and to penalize deviations operates through institutions, technologies, and practices that normalize particular forms of conduct. The VR environment reframes the old questions of surveillance in new, immersive ways. Where is the gaze located when you are wearing a headset? How is presence policed? What counts as legitimate labor in an economy that values virtual creations, but not equally recompenses the people who create them? Foucault helps us see how the micro-mechanisms of discipline, moderation policies, moderation bots, content guidelines, and social penalties contribute to a broader architecture of control that is both evident and subtle, both contemporary and ancient in its logic of power. In this narrative, the cross-reference to Ladder's actor network theory remains a fruitful tool for mapping the VR world's ongoing negotiation. If we view a VR platform as an assemblage of humans and non-humans, we see how interests translate across an entire network. The device's technical constraints shape what is possible, the software's rules shape what is permissible, the platform's revenue model shapes what kinds of content and labor are incentivized, and users' creative energies shape what communities emerge. The non-human actors, headsets, servers, algorithms, and virtual currencies exert agency in their own right, shaping outcomes even as human actors respond and adapt. The sense of governance that emerges from this view is not a centralized command, but a field of negotiation in which different actors jockey for influence, and the stability of the system depends upon continual translation, alignment, and occasional renegotiation of interests. The idea of digital sovereignty then becomes a matter of how this network can be reassembled to empower communities, protect privacy, and ensure fair compensation for labor, without stifling the creativity that makes VR compelling. Let me pause to offer a few primary source voices that lend texture to the arguments we've traced. Shoshana Zuboff's language about surveillance capitalism provides a stark frame for understanding VR's data practices. She writes in essence that surveillance capitalism unilaterally claims human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data. This is not a trivial claim about a few misuses. It is a claim about a foundational reorientation of value, where human experience becomes a commodity that is extracted and commodified through sophisticated, automated systems. In reading her work, one sees that the architecture of VR adds a new layer to this dynamic: immersive data streams, more intimate proxies for human preference, and more intricate methods of engagement optimization. Tiziana Terranova's analysis of free labor is equally instructive. She emphasizes that large sections of online labor are not compensated in the traditional wage sense, yet they are indispensable to the functioning of networks. In the VR context, consider the volunteer testers who provide feedback on new features, community moderators who enforce social norms, and creators who build assets without assured returns. Terranova's insight helps illuminate the invisible scaffolding that upholds a VR ecosystem, and the ethical questions that arise when valuable labor is rendered invisible or undercompensated. Bruno Latour's actor network theory invites us to look at the VR world as an assemblage of heterogeneous actants. The headset, the avatar, the algorithm, the moderation policy, the currency system, and the user's social identity all play their roles in translating the interests of different actors into a stable, functioning space. In Latour's terms, the social is not a fixed institution but a process of negotiation among diverse agents, human and non-human. When we apply ANT to VR's political economy, we see how governance, labor, and data are produced, stabilized, and contested through ongoing acts of alignment across a sprawling network. The cross-references to governance, censorship, and digital sovereignty also invite us to consider how the state and non-state actors interact within VR. Censorship regimes, legal frameworks for data protection, and sovereignty claims over virtual spaces are not simply a matter of one government imposing rules on a corporate platform. They involve a plurality of stakeholders, including platform operators, national regulators, civil society groups, and, importantly, the users themselves who advocate for more transparent practices, fair labor standards, and robust privacy protections. Foucault's framework helps interpret how power operates in these layered spaces. It's not solely about the coercive power of the state, but about the subtle ways in which surveillance, normalization, and governance operate through technical infrastructures, policies, and social norms. To conclude this segment, I want to invite you to carry two lines of thinking forward as you reflect on the philosophy of virtual reality in its political economy. First, ask how the architecture of a VR space, its devices, its servers, its policies, its currencies, shapes not only what you can do but who you become when you participate. If the space is designed to maximize engagement and data collection, what form of subjectivity is encouraged or coerced? If certain forms of labor are privileged or monetized in particular ways, how does that frame your sense of purpose, your identity, and your aspirations within the VR world? Second, consider how different governance arrangements might reframe these questions. What would it take to design VR ecosystems that respect privacy as a boundary of personal sovereignty, that fairly compensate creators and moderators for their labor, and that empower communities to shape rules and policies in a transparent, participatory manner? What would it look like to fuse Latour's networks with Terranova's critical lens and Zuboff's warning, not to conclude with despair, but to imagine institutional arrangements that can harness VR's transformative potential while curbing the excesses of surveillance capitalism? If you're listening as a thinker, a student, a creator, or a citizen, these questions matter beyond the screen. They matter for the kinds of social worlds we build, the kinds of relationships we cultivate, and the kinds of futures we want to leave for those who come after us. The hope, as with all philosophical inquiry, is not to settle the debate in a single authoritative verdict, but to sharpen the questions we ask, and to illuminate the stakes that are at play when we inhabit virtual spaces that are increasingly integrated into the fabric of everyday life. In VR, the questions of power, labor, privacy, and sovereignty are not theoretical avenues to pass through. They are present in the design of every avatar, every interaction, every space built, every policy clause, and every decision about who gets to tell the story of the metaverse and who gets to tell the next chapter. Now, as we close this segment, let me offer a few reflective provocations to carry with you into the next part of the video. Imagine a VR space governed by a collaborative charter. where creators, users, moderators, and regulators participate in decision-making through a transparent, participatory process, where data minimization is the default, and where users can opt into richer data-sharing arrangements with robust protections and clear opt-out mechanisms. Imagine a VR economy that includes fair wage standards for designers and moderators, with unions or collectives that negotiate terms of service, revenue sharing, and labor protections across platforms. Imagine also that the surveillance logics embedded in the architecture are visible to users in comprehensible dashboards, empowering them to understand what data is collected, how it is used, and when it can be shared with third parties. And finally, imagine a proto-metaverse and a modern metaverse that are not merely tools of consumption but spaces of civic imagination, where communities experiment with governance, design their own cultural practices, and cultivate a shared sense of digital sovereignty that respects both individual rights and the common good. In the end, the philosophy of virtual reality invites us to see an emergent social world not as a utopia or a dystopia, but as a field of possibilities, risk, and responsibility. By listening to the voices of Zuboff and Terranova, by engaging Latter's networked cosmos, and by paying attention to Foucault's enduring questions about power and the technologies that organize life, we can approach VR with both critical vigilance and ethical imagination. The VR future is being built now in the design labs, the code commits, the moderation decisions, the user communities, and the policy debates that accompany every new headset's launch. The question we must keep asking is not only what VR can do for us in terms of immersive experience, but what we owe to each other as we design, inhabit, and govern these shared virtual spaces. We have traversed a wide terrain, from the origins of platform capitalism to the intimate economies of VR chat and Second Life-inspired communities, from the bold metaverse ambitions of today's tech giants to the countervailing possibilities for democratization and environmental mitigation. From the anecdotes that map the arc of hardware, platform shifts, and proto-metaverse experiments to the theoretical lenses that illuminate how power, labor, and data circulate within these networks. If you have found yourself thinking about the fragility of digital sovereignty, the ethics of digital labor, or the politics of surveillance in immersive environments, you are engaging with questions that historians, philosophers, and technologists alike have wrestled with for decades, though VR adds a new, urgent tempo to them. As we move toward the next segment, we will continue to unpack how governance, censorship, and digital sovereignty unfold in practice. We will examine additional case studies and voices, include more primary source textures, and translate these big ideas into concrete implications for policy, design, and community life. We will also keep returning to the central claim. Virtual reality in its most transformative forms is not only a matter of hardware and software, it is a space where power is imagined, contested, and renegotiated. The way we creators, users, policymakers, scholars choose to participate will help determine whether VR becomes a space for liberatory experimentation, for intensified surveillance, or for something in between. A plural, contested, evolving social landscape where the future is negotiated rather than foreclosed. If you're still with me, take a moment to reflect on the two concrete examples we started with. The metaverse ambitions of large platforms, with data practices that seek to map, predict, and monetize even the most intimate facets of our digital lives, and the real-world VR communities whose labor, creativity, and identity economies illustrate both the promise and the peril of immersive technologies. The world these examples point toward is not a frozen snapshot but a living conversation. It is a conversation across platforms and communities, across policymakers and theorists, across hardware and software, and across the very borders we thought were digital but are in truth political as well as technical. So as you continue watching and listening, carry with you a sense of responsibility, not merely to understand VR's social and political economy, but to participate in shaping it toward more transparent governance, fair labor standards, robust privacy protections, and a more inclusive and accountable digital future. The debate is ongoing, the stakes are high, and the responsibility belongs to us all. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping into a room where the air carries not just sound, but a sense of being pressed back by space itself. In virtual reality, presence is not merely a feeling of being there in a clever headset. It is a recalibration of how we experience embodiment, time, and meaning. The philosophy of virtual reality asks not only what is possible in technology, but what is possible in perception, in narrative, and in society when form and sensation become one. It asks us to listen to the quiet questions that arise when science fiction becomes tactile, and when art ceases to be merely seen and becomes aligned with the body's opening to space. In this section, we will explore origins, key thinkers, and the arguments that shape the aesthetics and ethics of VR as art, narrative, and phenomenology. We will travel through the lineage of embodied perception, symbolic form, enactive perception, and filmic aesthetics adapted to immersive media. We will pair theory with concrete works, old tensions with new possibilities, and a few hard counterarguments that remind us, even the most vivid virtual worlds must face the world they promise to transcend. Let us begin with origins, not as a simple tale of gadgets, but as a philosophical question about the body's place in perception. VR emerges at a moment when philosophy can still trouble the easy distinction between seeing and knowing, between the mind's interior life and the world it inhabits. The phenomenological tradition, above all the work of Merleau-Ponty, offers a generous vocabulary for thinking about VR as more than a set of devices. In Merleau-Ponty's account, the body is not a mere object among objects. It is the general medium through which we have a world. He writes, in effect, that perception arises from the body's practical engagement with its environment, from the way we reach, grasp, line, move, and anticipate. The body is our general medium for having a world. The exact words, spoken as if in mid-conversation with a space that responds to weight and intention, remind us that to perceive is to find ourselves in a context that we inhabit with our whole being. In VR, that inhabitation is intensified. The headset becomes an extension of the body's reach, the controllers map our intent into space, and the haptic and auditory cues become a kind of hapticoral grammar that the brain learns to interpret as presence. What does it mean to translate Merleau-Ponty's embodied perception into immersive form? It means clarifying how the body anchors meaning when the space around us can be manipulated, redesigned, even created from nothing. VR art does not merely place images before the eye. It invites the body to move through space as if space itself were a material capable of weighing our decisions. The question of embodiment then becomes a central aesthetic problem. How does a work of VR become legible not just as a set of images, but as a lived field of sensation, where the viewer's posture, balance, and gestures contribute to the unfolding of meaning? If Merleau-Ponty gives us a ground for thinking about embodied perception, Suzanne Langer supplies a crucial instrument for understanding how VR can be meaningful through symbolic form. In her influential claim that art is the symbolic form through which feeling and thought are made present, Langer points us toward a key distinction. Art does not simply depict the world. It provides a symbolic vehicle by which human experience is transformed into form that can be apprehended, reflected upon, and felt. In VR, the symbolic form is not only the narrative or the visual texture, but the entire phenomenology of immersion. The way space becomes a language, the way tempo and rhythm encode mood, the way the body's movements translate emotion into a choreography of space. When we inhabit osmose-like environments, for instance, the space is not background scenery. It becomes a symbolic organ through which a form of knowing, felt, experiential, sometimes preconceptual, emerges. The body's motion, the space's geometry, the way light answers a gesture, all contribute to a symbolic system that users interpret as meaningful. Langer's insistence on art as symbolic form helps us resist a hasty claim that VR art is merely impressive technology. It invites us to treat immersive works as expressive systems that carry and embody human feeling, as if the world itself were a language we come to speak with our bodies. The transition from embodied perception to film aesthetics adapted for immersive media invites another shared voice into the conversation, Niall Carroll. Carroll's work on film aesthetics insists that cinema does not merely present events. It shapes perception through particular cinematic forms, patterns of montage, rhythm, gaze, and spatial arrangement that generate a distinctive perceptual experience. When we move from film to VR, we confront a new scale of involvement. Depth as a participatory condition, interactivity as a grammar of narrative causality, and time as something not strictly linear but manipulable. The VR environment can domesticate or dislodge our expectations of narrative flow. In Carroll's terms, VR has to negotiate how form organizes the viewer's attention and emotional response. The viewer is not a passive spectator, but an active interpreter who negotiates choices, awaits cues, and experiences time through the interface's tempo and the space's topology. The adaptation of film aesthetics to VR raises a practical question. Can the older logic of shot-based storytelling, built on the illusion of a stable viewer in a fixed position, still govern immersive pieces that move with you, pivot around your gaze, and invite you to alter course with a flick of a hand or a step forward? The answer for many artists and theorists is that VR must enrich the vocabulary of film aesthetics rather than replace it. It must attend to the ways in which presence, this felt sense of being there, reframes what counts as a scene, a cut, a moment of revelation, or a moment of pause. Alongside these navigations of embodiment in symbolic form, we have Nye's inactive account of perception. Nye argues that perception is not a passive reception of stimuli, but a form of skilled, embodied activity. Perception arises when we actively engage with the world. It is the result of a dynamic coupling between the organism, the space it inhabits, and the tools it uses to explore that space. In the VR context, this is especially resonant. Headsets and controllers are not mere gadgets, they are extension devices through which the viewer enacts a sense of the possible. The world's edges, its textures, its gravity, its affordances, these are not just presented to us. They are negotiated with us through movement, haptics, and intention. When you reach toward a virtual surface and your hand meets a response, you are no longer observing an object from a distance. You are enacting a relationship with it. Nye's insistence on perception as action helps us understand why VR can feel immediately compelling and unsettling at once, because it makes visible the fact that meaning is co-authored by the body's active engagement and by the space's responsive properties. VR art and storytelling thus unfold through a choreography of action and perception that aligns with enactive philosophy, turning the viewer into a co-creator of the world's meaning. To bring these theoretical threads into direct contact with practice, let us bring in some pioneers and works that have helped shape how we think about VR aesthetics, narrative, and presence. Char Davies' Osmose remains a landmark in foregrounding embodiment in space. Osmose, first appearing in 1995, was not simply a virtual environment, but a philosophical experiment in dissolving boundaries between body and space. Davies designed Osmose as a space where the body's movements, breathing, lining, turning, triggered experiences that felt introspective and metamorphic. The space itself seemed to respond to weight and momentum, as if the user's body and the virtual environment were in a continuous, mutual influence. Osmose invites us to inhabit a world not as a surface to be looked at, but as a space to be lived through. It stages an encounter with space that is at once meditative and awakening, a decentering of conventional sight that resonates with the phenomenology of embodiment. If Merleau-Ponty anchored perception in the body's structural position in the world, Osmose demonstrates what that position feels like when the world is designed to be inhabited by the whole body rather than observed by a detached observer. But Osmose is not a lone beacon in a dark field. The 1990s, as a decade of art and technology experiments, produced a constellation of VR works and experiments that seeded later developments. In the broader arc of VR history, Geoffrey Shaw's Legible City, a project that began in the late 1980s and continued into the early 1990s, marries textual landscapes with immersive navigation. The Legible City invites viewers to fly through a cityscape composed of textual content, streets, avenues, and avenues of type that you can traverse. It is not merely about reading as a viewer. It is about becoming part of the typographic ecosystem, letting the form of language shape your movement and your sense of space. The work challenges the boundary between reading and writing through space, between narrative content and spatial architecture. It is an early example of how immersive form can reconfigure your sense of time, your sense of orientation, and your relationship to information itself. The anecdotal memory of those early experiments, artists and technicians wearing head-mounted displays, grappling with latency, calibration, and the uncanny sensation of being elsewhere, functions as a historical anecdote that clarifies where immersive aesthetics began to drift from mere simulation toward a language of embodied experience. Into the 2010s, a different wave rises, one that meets consumer technologies with a language of art and narrative rather than laboratory curiosity alone. The resurgence of immersive cinema and gaming in the 2010s, aided by consumer headsets such as the Rift and Vive, created a new ecology where VR could be used for storytelling, art, and even cinema-like experiences. Tilt Brush, released around 2015-2016, exemplifies a shift toward VR as a tool for pure creative expression. In Tilt Brush, you do not merely observe a painting. You paint in space with your entire arm and body moving through air that maps to a three-dimensional canvas. The act of painting becomes a choreography in space, a performance of time and motion as the brush leaves trails of light that you can walk around, inspect from different angles, and recolor with gestures that carry a sense of immediacy. Tilt Brush foregrounds the idea that artistic form in VR is not a projection of flat images onto a screen but a spatial practice. The artwork exists as a field, a sculpture, a volume, something you can walk inside and touch with intention, even if your hands physically only hover in front of you. The The methodological implication here is that VR expands the vocabulary of art from the two-dimensional plane to three-dimensional, navigable, live space, and the viewer becomes a co-architect of the object, participating in its emergence. The Blue, another widely discussed immersive work, situates the viewer in a sublime underwater panorama where life moves in slow, graceful arcs around you. The Blue is not only an audiovisual spectacle. It is a meditation on scale, movement, and the ethics of immersion in nature's vastness. The experience uses immersive hardware to place you within a living ocean whose creatures respond to your presence with a certain intelligence. The viewer's position, small in the ocean's vastness, yet never entirely powerless, creates a tension between awe and vulnerability, a mood that invites contemplation of our human place within a broader ecologies. In this sense, the Blue translates a classic modernist impulse toward awe into a contemporary medium, where the body's presence, the space's immensity, and the viewer's interpretive agency, your choices about when to swim, where to look, how to react, contribute to a narrative of encounter rather than a conventional plot. And then there is the question of narrative form in VR. How does interactivity alter our sense of time, causality, and meaning? Interactive VR narratives and nonlinear storytelling can distort time perception in fascinating ways. A number of projects in the 2010s and 2020s offered nonlinear experiences that do not simply unfold a linear tale, but present a lattice of possibilities whose coherence arises not from a single path but from the act of choosing among paths or letting the space itself reorganize events. The experience of time in VR can be dilated, accelerated, or looped, depending on how the user's actions affect the world's pacing. In some pieces, a viewer can pause a dramatic moment by stepping back or by pausing interaction. In others, the user's proximity or gaze can trigger micro-narratives that insinuate micro-choices, each one altering a broader arc. These nonlinearities are not mere gimmicks. They are a cognitive complement to Langer's idea of symbolic form. The space itself becomes a symbolic field in which time is a craft rather than a fixed dimension. The narrative unfolds through action and exploration, not solely through dialogue and plot. To illustrate with concrete examples, consider immersive artworks that foreground embodiment in space, akin to osmose. The immersive experiences that evoke a sense of one's body in space often rely on a carefully designed set of sensory cues, breath, posture, balance, micro-movements, that invite the user to inhabit the environment as a living body within a living space. A number of contemporary VR installations approximate this lineage. Spaces where the architecture itself seems to respond to weight shifts, where the floor's surfaces tilt or give way to exaggerated gravitational cues, where lighting responds to the viewer's breath and motion. In these works, the user's body is not a passive sensor. It is a vehicle for meaning. The textural complexity of space, its gradients of gravity, its luminous transitions, its portal-like corridors, gives rise to experiences that feel not like watching an image, but like engaging a living field that you can walk, stretch, lean into, or drift through. The narrative is not a story told to you. It is a felt encounter with a space that suggests questions about self, other, and the relationship between mind and world. These works align closely with Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology and with Naya's enactive perception, because they require you to act within space in order for the space to reveal its sense. Immersive VR narratives and nonlinear storytelling that alter time perception. Immersive narratives in VR frequently adopt a mesh of branching pathways, but not in a way that simply produces alternative endings. Instead, they interrogate how time feels when your movement can change the pacing, when your attention can jump from one anchor to another, when memory itself can be reconstituted by spatial and tactile cues. A notable contemporary experience might center on a sequence that can be traversed in multiple orders, where you can linger in a paused moment to reflect on a scene's moral consequence, then proceed to another scene whose events would have altered your earlier impression if experienced in a different sequence. The result is not a movie with interactivity grafted on top. It is a new form of narrative where the act of choosing, pausing, and returning becomes an ethical and aesthetic decision. In such works, the concept of time is programmable. The same passage of seconds in external terms may correspond to different interior durations for the viewer depending on how attention is distributed, how the body is engaged, and how the environment reacts to movement. We should now consider two concrete counterarguments about the VR aesthetic to keep our discussion honest and balanced. First, immersive VR can become escapism or fuel apathy toward real-world concerns. When we inhabit an environment that is richly responsive, incredibly beautiful, and emotionally engaging, it is easy for attention to drift away from pressing social, political, or ecological issues. The risk is not simply indulgence in pleasure, it is the shaping of perception in a way that detaches urgent matters from the sense-making apparatus we carry into them. If VR becomes a sanctuary where we curate flawless experiences, we might habituate ourselves to prefer controlled environments over messy, contested reality. The ethics of representation become thorny here, whose stories are being told and who is listened to when the space offers enchantment as a default mode. If the profit motive drives a market of hyperreal experiences with dazzling visuals but narrow perspective, the risk is that VR art becomes a tailored commodity that stabilizes taste rather than challenging it, that it contributes to a culture of consumption where time itself is bought and sold as an experience rather than earned through effort or reflection. Second, concerns about commodification of experience and the homogenization of aesthetic forms. In a market that prizes scalable immersion, there is a danger that VR aesthetics converge toward a recognizable, easily monetizable syntax. Smooth locomotion, high-resolution visuals, cinematic pacing, and a template of interactivity that promises endless replay value. If these features become the universal language of VR art, there is a temptation toward sameness, the same spatial grammar, the same gesture-based interactions, the same emotional cues. The fear is that the uniqueness of individual artists' imaginaries gets overshadowed by a mass-produced sense of immersive correctness. In short, there is a real possibility that the commodification of VR experiences produces a homogenized aesthetic universe, one in which difference has to yield to market viability. The counterargument to this is that immersive media inherently expands by multiplying possible forms of knowledge, and that a market can also support experimental work if it is willing to accept high-risk, high-variance projects. The conversation then becomes about governance, funding models, and curatorial strategies that value experimentation and diversity of voices, not just the blockbuster vocabulary of presence. If we shift to the ethical dimension, what emerges is a set of moral questions that VR prompts with unusual force. Embodiment makes representation a question of responsibility in new ways. When you stand inside a space and your body is part of the work's dynamic, questions about who is allowed to inhabit that space, how consent is negotiated for intimate or invasive experiences, and how identities are portrayed become central. Consider a VR project that invites you to inhabit the perspective of a character whose body is marked by disability, race, or gender in vivid terms. The question of how accurately or respectfully such experiences are rendered becomes a matter of ethical stewardship. If Langer's symbolic form offers a route to understanding how art conveys feeling and thought, VR's symbolic form also raises questions about who defines what the symbols mean, who has the authority to interpret them, and how the symbol's power is distributed across different communities. The ethics of representation in VR art thus include consent, privacy, consent to be observed, consent to be visually quantified by avatars and motion data, and the responsibility to avoid reinscribing stereotypes through repeated, uncritical use of particular bodies, narratives, and states of vulnerability. To connect theory with more explicit cross-references, we can draw on Baudrillard's notion of hyperreality. Baudrillard writes, "We live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning. In VR, this tension becomes palpable. The acceleration of sensory information, the precision of rendering, the abundance of interactive possibilities all present an overwhelming field of stimulation. Yet meaning does not automatically accompany such abundance. The VR experience demands interpretive work. The viewer must decide what to attend to, what to value, and what to shape into a narrative or emotion. The hyperreal dimension arises when the boundary between what is real in the body's lived experience and what is constructed by the virtual world becomes porous. When you forget that you are wearing a headset, you begin to inhabit what feels like a real place rather than a constructed environment. But that very sense of being there challenges us to ask, what is real about the experience, and what is the function of the representation that makes it feel convincing? Baudrillard's warning becomes a practical invitation. In VR, the question of reality passes through the question of meaning, and meaning passes through the negotiation of representation, ethics, and control of the technological instrument. If we look toward Nye's enactive perception framework and merge it with the cinematic insights suggested by Carroll, a coherent set of questions arises. How does the viewer, as an embodied agent, co-create meaning within a VR narrative? How does the form of the space, the architecture, the lighting, the physics structure perception? How do the temporal rhythms of action and interactivity shape aesthetic experience? In VR, these questions become operational. The viewer's motor actions matter. The way a space responds to your gaze and your balance matters. The way you can alter time by pausing, rewinding, or accelerating sequences matters. The alliance among the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, the symbolic form of Langer, the inactive insight of Nye, and the film aesthetic sensibilities adapted to immersive media. This alliance gives a robust framework for understanding VR art not as a gadget, but as a reconfiguration of perception, narrative, and ethics. Let us return to two more concrete historical strands that illuminate how these ideas have unfolded in the public sphere. First, the art/tech experiments of the 1990s in VR art. Here the seedbed includes not only Osmose, but also an array of experiments in universities, museums, and research labs that sought to test what immersion could mean beyond simulation. In those early years, artists and technologists wrestled with latency, presence, proprioception, and the ethics of immersion in ways that resemble a philosophical studio more than a product development team. The 1990s offered a rough terrain where high hopes and technical limitations shared the stage. The result was a language of immersion that had yet to settle into mainstream expectations. The early works were not polished entertainment, but speculative experiments in what it could feel like to live in a space that is both made and inhabited by the body. Second, the resurgence of immersive cinema and gaming in the 2010s with consumer headsets. The consumerization of VR changed the stakes. No longer were the majority of VR projects dependent on institutional funding or specialized hardware. The potential audience expanded, and with it came new demands for accessibility, comfort, and narrative clarity. Tilt Brush, as a creative tool, demonstrated how new media could be used for artistic practice in ways previously unimaginable. It made space feel like a canvas you could walk into, literally painting with your limbs in a three-dimensional environment. The blue offered a different form of immersion, a sense of humility before a larger, incomprehensibly vast underwater world, where scale and time become moral partners in a meditation on our place in a world beyond the self. And more recently, the proliferation of VR experiences that combine high-fidelity visuals with deep, intimate storytelling has given rise to new ways of thinking about how cinema and theater can intersect with interactive technology. The resurgence is not merely about better hardware. It is about a renewed attention to how narrative, performance, and perception can work together in space to produce a particular kind of meaning. One that invites you to reflect on what it means to be a perceiving, acting, and responsible participant in a world that may very well be partly created by your own hands. In engaging with these historical trajectories, we should keep two lines of cross-reference in view. Baudrillard's hyperreality invites us to scrutinize the fidelity and value of immersive representations. The more immersive the experience, the more we must ask whether our attention is being captured by meaningful content or by the seduction of realism that masks social or political oversight. Film theory offers a vocabulary for how immersive works can structure attention and evoke emotion through the embodied experience of time, space, and rhythm. The theater and performance studies tradition helps us think about presence as a form of co-presence, a shared time with an audience that is not purely spectator but participant in a staging of perception and emotion. And ethics in immersive media demands that we confront questions about consent, agency, representation, and the distribution of power in who gets to tell stories, whose bodies are centered or marginalized, and how the potential for manipulation in seemingly intimate experiences is addressed. Let us bring in two more threads to illuminate modern interpretations of VR aesthetics and narrative. First, the question of space as a stage for identity and social relations. When VR places us inside a space where avatars and interfaces mediate contact with others, representation becomes a new site of political concern. Avatar design, how bodies are depicted, how movement is captured, what identities are available or normalized, becomes a social issue. The philosophy of perception once again speaks here. Embodiment is not just a mental event, it is a social and cultural event that can shape how we think about ourselves and others. The VR space becomes a social field in which ethics, aesthetics, and politics converge. Second, the question of time and memory. Immersive narratives can restructure temporal experience. If you can pause time, rewind a moment, or move forward in a space where cause and effect unfold across layers of space, memory itself becomes a navigable resource. The viewer may revisit a moment to reflect on its moral implications, or to explore how different actions could have led to alternate outcomes. These possibilities invite a more nuanced view of storytelling that refuses to treat interactivity as a mere gimmick. The real value lies in how the viewer is invited to enact time as a creative force, a principle that resonates with Langer's concept of symbolic form and with Nye's insistence on perception as action. When we step back to read VR through the lens of cross-referenced ideas, a composite picture emerges. VR art sits at the intersection of embodied phenomenology, symbolic form and active perception, filmic aesthetics, and ethical reflection. It is not an isolated technical field. It is a philosophical practice in which artists and audiences negotiate what it means to be present, to tell stories, and to inhabit worlds that feel as real as the one outside the headset. It is a medium that invites us to rethink what counts as space, what constitutes a narrative, and how we treat representation. The practice grows by drawing on the tradition of immersion to question how we define reality, and by questioning the very assumptions about art's role in a digital age where image, gesture, and body are in constant dialogue. In closing this segment, I want to offer a few practical questions you might carry into your own engagement with VR art and VR narrative. First, how does a work's spatial design influence your body's sense of agency? When you feel the floor shift under your feet or the space tilt into a new orientation, what does that do to your sense of responsibility within the piece's ethical scenario? Second, how does time feel in an immersive piece? Do you experience time as something manipulable by your own actions, or as something that relentlessly drags you forward, as if you were a passenger on a moving train? Third, whose voices are privileged in a VR work, and how does the work attend to diverse bodies, experiences, and histories? Fourth, how might a VR artwork be used in education, therapy, or civic discourse without losing its aesthetic integrity or becoming a mere instrument of persuasion? And finally, what does it mean to inhabit a world that is, in part, yours to shape? The questions are not mere curiosities. They point toward a practice of looking and acting that honors the flesh-and-bone sense that Merleau-Ponty makes central, honors the symbolic power of art emphasized by Langer, respects Nye's insistence that perception is action, and remains attentive to Baudrillard's warning about representation and meaning in a hyperreal landscape. We should also offer readers and listeners some pointers toward primary sources and people whose voices continue to shape this field. Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology remains a pole star for thinking about how VR makes space feel lived. Suzanne Langer's articulation of art as symbolic form provides a language for understanding why immersive space can feel like a language you can inhabit with your body and your emotion. Nye's active perception frames what it means to perceive through action, an idea that resonates with how VR invites you to act in space in order to experience meaning. Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality offers a cautionary counterpoint. The more immersive an experience, the more careful we must be about what counts as reality and what counts as representation. Zipping these threads together with the practical and historical case studies, from osmose to tilt brush, from the blue to CT scans of sculpture in VR, we see a field that is not merely about new technology, but about rethinking perception, narrative, and ethics in a world where space, time, and meaning can be remade with a touch and a gesture. Let us culminate with an invitation to reflect on the broader horizon of VR as aesthetics, narrative, and future reality. If we treat VR as a philosophical laboratory, we discover that its most compelling works do not only push the envelope of what machines can render, but they push the envelope of what humans can become in response to those renders. They ask us to consider, what is the role of art in shaping how we live, how we relate to others, and how we think about our own embodiment in a space that can be altered at will? They prompt us to ask whether the future of reality in any sense will be more faithfully observed, more deeply felt, or more ethically tested than ever before. The answers will come not only from engineers detailing the capabilities of headsets and trackers, but from artists and theorists who live inside these spaces, wrestle with their implications, and articulate, through pattern and pause, what it means to be human when the walls between world and simulation begin to blur. In this sense, the philosophy of virtual reality is not a retreat from the question of reality, but a reapportioning of it. It invites us to scrutinize how presence is constituted, how form makes meaning, and how time can be braided with space to tell stories that matter. It invites a patient, careful listening to the voices of Merleau-Ponty and Nye, to the symbolic intuition of Langer, to the critical horizon of Baudrillard, and to the many artists who, through osmose, the blue, tilt brush, CT scan sculptures, and immersive narratives, teach us what it might mean to live, if only temporarily, in a world whose boundaries are no longer fixed but negotiable by gesture, intention, and care. The future of VR art and VR experience will be decided not only by who writes the code or who builds the headset, but by who enters these spaces with awareness, ethics, and curiosity, ready to co-create a reality that is at once technically astonishing, aesthetically rigorous, and morally responsible. Whether we inhabit it as escape, as exploration, or as a laboratory for new forms of social life, VR remains a mirror and a doorway. A mirror that reveals the contours of perception, and a doorway that invites us to step into a space where form and feeling are inseparable, and where the future of reality itself may be authored by the play of embodiment, symbol, action, and narrative.